A delicate condition. Chapter 1. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. Part 1. They're in the elven city of Lantha when Rayla realizes that something's off. The wedding's in 2 weeks. She's needed at home for some final preparations. Lantha's on the way and, in any case, they want Callum in town to discuss the idea of what a curriculum might even look like if the mags here took on human apprentices. It's as convenient a rest stop as any, and given the waves of nausea that keep washing over her, Rayla is, a lot, grateful for the opportunity to stop for a day or two before the rest of the ride home. They'd ridden into city a few days ago. The Council of Elders had offered them rooms at one of the finer inns closer to the center of the city, and, too nauseous to argue for a single one, Rayla had handed Vorobei off to Callum and hurried inside and to throw up in the nearest bathroom. It was probably nothing, she'd told herself as she gagged into the bowl. It wouldn't have been the first time Callum's fireside cooking had made her sick to her stomach, and the fish he'd fried up the other night did taste a little funny towards the middle. What's weird is the fact that they've been here 3 days and she's sick still. I really think you should see a healer, says Callum. There's concern in his frown as he holds her hair back and rubs a hand against her shoulder. He'd spent the night in her room and had come after her when she climbed out of bed this morning to heave into the toilet. Or you could never cook again, grumbles Rayla. She takes in a shuddering breath and shifts a little, putting her weight against the wall to her left with a groan. Callum wrinkles his nose at her. I ate that fish too. I'm not throwing up. Maybe you've just got an immunity to your own cooking. She smirks at him, despite herself, enjoying the playful little scowl that crosses his face before the nausea hits her again and she scrambles onto her knees to retch into the bowl. I think you should take the day off, Ray. Fine, groans Rayla. She wipes off her mouth with the back of her hand and settles against the wall again, her eyes shut and her breaths shallow as she tries to will the nausea away. I just need a minute. He makes a face at her. Rayla. No. Rayla. I'm fine, Callum, she snaps. It comes out harsher than she intends, and she relents. Sorry. You shouldn't be out by yourself. You're the Prince of Catolis. He snorts at her. Also an archmage who forged his own connection to all 6 primal sources, but you know. He brushes her hair out of her face and presses his lips to her forehead, a wordless reminder that she can tell him she's fine all she likes, but he'll worry anyway because he loves her that much. It makes her smile and it settles her breathing, even as nausea builds in her throat once more. She forces it away. I know things are different now, she manages at last. But I'll feel better if I can be with you. And I'll feel better if you go and see a healer, he says pointedly. He settles in front of her, his back against the opposite wall, his knees close enough to her that she leans over to rest her cheek against his patella. I'll cut you a deal. If you come with me today and you're still nauseous after this meeting, you have to go and see someone about it, okay? His concern for her is sweet, his eyes so green and so earnest that she sighs, nods, and picks herself up off the bathroom floor. Okay, she says at last, holding an arm out to help him. But only if I'm still nauseous. Fair. He smiles. Fair. X. She's a bit paler than usual, Callum thinks, but she's otherwise fine by the time they get to the university. He tries not to worry about it too much. Rayla's the strongest person he knows, and she's not about to let a stomach bug get her down, but still, he watches her out of the corner of his eye before their meeting with the university scholars, and during, only sort of paying attention to their concerns. I am uncomfortable with this, Prince Callum, one of the scholars, Saria, Callum thinks her name is saying. Allowing humans to study magic is one thing, but allowing them access to our primal stones is a necessary part of allowing humans to learn magic, finishes Callum sternly. Gatekeeping magic is what made humans turn to dark magic in the first place, and it's unreasonable to expect anyone to be limited to the theoretical aspects of magic. Practical application is what that theory is for. Saria makes a face, clearly still wary of the idea. Our primal stones take a great deal of magic and experience to create. We can't be expected to just give them away. So let your human apprentices earn them, says Callum. Assist them in making their own as a sort of graduation. From theoretical magic to practical magic. if they don't forge their own connection with the primal first. Saria and her peers pause. They look surprised, but not averse to the idea, and Callum glances at Rayla from the corner of his eye and finds himself pleased by the proud little smile on her lips. "We'll consider it," says Saria, at last. Callum nods, happy with today's progress. "I can submit an official proposal to you by tomorrow," he says. "Thank you for your time today." He gets to his feet. Beside him, Rayla does the same, her smile falling just a little as she sways on the spot. He pauses. "Rayla." She shakes her head at him. "It's fine," she mutters quietly. Her voice cracks and she pales a little more. "I'm fine." Then her knees buckle and she crumples, and Callum yelps, panic and terror flooding his system as he catches her in his arms before she hits the ground. She wakes in a cot in a room she doesn't recognize with a bit of cotton taped to her arm, and Callum, frowning over her on the chair by the bed. She's nauseous again, and she groans, her head spinning as she tries to sit up. "You said you were okay," grumbles Callum, his concern furrowing his brow as he reaches forward to steady her. He gets up and settles on the cot next to her, resting a hand on her knee as he studies the pallor of her face. "I thought I was," mumbles Rayla. She shuts her eyes tight and rubs at her temples, her jaw clenched shut as she forces the bile rising in her throat to stay down. The door opens, Rayla winces at the sound, and an elf in healer's robes strides into the room and shuts it behind him. His skin is pale, paler than Rayla's, even, his hair dark, his eyes silver and serious, but he offers them both a kind smile as he takes a seat in Callum's vacated chair. "Your Highness," he says to Callum, bowing. "And, my lady, I suppose, but I've been told you just prefer Rayla." "You were told correctly," says Rayla, a little hoarsely. "Of course," says the healer. "I have some news. Would you prefer if we spoke in private?" Rayla shakes her head. "This is fine. If it's anything serious, he's going to find out anyway." "It really depends on what you call serious," chuckles the healer. "If I might ask, how long ago was your last cycle?" Rayla stares at him, mostly because she's unsure. "A while ago," she thinks, but she hasn't really been keeping track. Things have been busy, there've been a flurry of meetings since the beginning of the month, and the closer things get to the wedding, the less time she has to think about something as inconsequential as her monthly bleeds. But the question startles her, because it can only really be relevant if. Rayla pales. He can't be saying, "But they'd been so careful," and "it would make a lot of sense," but surely she can't be. The healer must see the conclusion come together on her face, because his smile softens, understanding of the panic welling in her chest. Beside her, Callum only frowns more, the connection not quite as obvious to him as it is to her. "I don't understand," he says. "Is something wrong? Is she okay?" The healer offers him what Rayla thinks is supposed to be a reassuring smile, before he leans forward in his chair and looks her in the eye. "You're pregnant, Rayla," he says gently. It's worse hearing it in actual words. The room spins again, and for a moment, Rayla thinks she might faint a second time, but Callum's hand grips hers tight, and she forces herself to focus on the healer. "She's what?" breathes Callum, blinking. "Pregnant," the healer tells them. He grins toothily at him, obviously unfussed by any and all of the implications running rampant through Rayla's head. "With, I can only assume, your child, Your Highness. You're having a baby." Callum's shoulders slump. He pales, and then flushes, and then pales again in such quick succession that Rayla wonders if he might faint too. She wouldn't blame if he did. She thinks she might herself. Notes. Prompts filled. From an Anon on Tumblr, Rayla discovers pregnancy. Chapter 2. Summary. "It'll be a quick 9 months," the healer says, looking genuinely happy for them. "It'll feel like no time at all." Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. 2. 7 weeks, the healer says, but Rayla hardly hears him. She stares at her knees the whole time, the concept barely grasped, the wholeness of it so large that she's unsure where to even begin. She's never missed her tea, or at least, she doesn't think she ever has, and while, in her head, she's always known that no contraception method is foolproof, the idea that there's life growing within her now is. It's terrifying. Beside her, Callum is wordless. He holds her fingers tight within his jaw clenched and his knuckles white, looking entirely dumbstruck by the news. The healer ends up talking at them, rather than to them, his voice gentle and understanding of their half-attention. He puts a bottle of vitamins and a bottle of antiemetic draft into Rayla's hands. She's to take a sip of each once a day, he tells her, the first to keep up her own health as well as the baby's, the second to ease the nausea until it settles by itself in a few weeks. He gives Callum a wad of notes, frequently asked questions, he's told, and ways he might be able to help her when he's not sure what else he can do. He gives them both a list of what to expect over the next 9 months, tells Rayla that she should feel the baby quicken in her 5th month, and Callum that he should be able to feel it move in her 6th, advises them to see a healer or a midwife if anything doesn't go accordingly, no matter how minuscule they think the issue is, and when it feels like he's talked himself hoarse, he smiles and congratulates them both. It'll be a quick 9 months, he says, looking genuinely happy for them. It'll feel like no time at all. He means to reassure them, Rayla thinks, but the idea of a quick 9 months only scares her more. The world is still spinning when she hops off the cot, and Callum steadies her, his grip warm and tight, but not as comforting as she wishes it could be. She holds it together until they get back to her room at the inn, where she tears her hand from his and makes a beeline for the bathroom to throw up once more. Callum follows her, easing her bangs out of her face without complaint as she heaves into the toilet. "You're okay," he murmurs, although his voice shakes and ruins the facade of his composure. The healer said this was normal. "You're okay." Rayla groans. Her own terror in combination with being sick makes it hard to breathe, her heart hammering so quickly and so heavily in her throat that she can't keep up. She shudders, even as Callum rubs his hands across her back, even as he whispers words of comfort to her as she all but sobs into the bowl. "I can't do this," she manages hoarsely. "Yes, you can," he says gently. "It'll pass." She shakes her head. The bile burns in her throat. Her breathing is heavy and labored as she tries to force herself to settle, but the very idea of the child growing in her belly puts her nerves into a frenzy. She slumps against the seat, her forehead pressed into her arms, tears leaking unpermitted from her eyes. "I can't be pregnant, Callum," she rasps, her panic getting the better of her. "We're not even married, we've barely even talked about having kids, and I don't know that I..." Hey, it's okay." He shifts onto his knees behind her and presses a kiss into her shoulder. His hands are shaking too, she thinks, or perhaps that's just her. "The wedding's only 2 weeks away," he says, "and even if it wasn't, I'd never leave you to do this by yourself. This was always a possibility, and, I dunno, I always thought we'd have them later, but this isn't so bad." Rayla shakes her head a second time and stifles a groan in her arms. "I can't be a mother," she whispers. "I don't know how." "What do you mean? You're great with kids. Look at how much Lessa loves you. This is different." She swallows, her eyes shut tight as another wave of nausea washes over her. "Lessa's not ours. This baby," she pauses, the words foreign and unfamiliar on her tongue. "Our baby, Callum, what if we mess it up? What if I mess it up? I don't know that I can be a mother and... Hey." He kisses her shoulder once more, a breathy chuckle ghosting across her skin as he slips a hand around her waist and rests it low on her belly. "I'm scared too," he says finally. It's an admission for her as much as it is for him, and Rayla finds herself grateful for the way he doesn't expect her to say it out loud herself. "The fact that our baby is growing inside of you right now, gods, Rayla, I'm terrified, but I trust you, and I love you, and there's no one I'd rather do this with than you." He pauses, and when she doesn't gag again, he wraps her in his arms entirely and presses a kiss into her cheek. "We're gonna be fine," he promises. "Everything's going to be fine." She hiccoughs, but her breathing steadies when her fingers find his. She shifts a little and finds her eyes drawn to her belly. She stares at it for the longest time, their hands joined and resting over it, his mother's ring glinting on her finger in the pale light. She'd never known her own mother. Not really. Her parents had been whisked off to defend ZYMZ before she'd ever had the chance, and maybe that's why she's so scared now. But Callum's warmth and his faith in her is comforting. She lets out a shaky sigh, exhausted by the news, and by the nausea that feels as if it's finally settled, before she allows Callum to help her off the bathroom floor and walk her to bed. He pulls off her boots for her and unclasps her belt, his hands pausing at her abdomen on their way past. Awe flashes in his eyes, and, too late, Rayla realizes how strange it must be for him to know that his child is growing within her womb. He presses a kiss to her there, over her shirt and coat, his smile nervous and scared and excited all at once before he eases her into bed and presses the vial of antiemetic draft into her hand. "Take some now," he says. "I'll get you some water, and then I think you should take the rest of the day off." Rayla shakes her head, afraid of the idea of him being alone in an elven city and of the idea of being alone with her thoughts, but he shushes her with a kiss against her knuckles. "I won't go far," he tells her. "Just to get you some water, and then I'll come straight back to look after you." There's a part of Rayla that wants to object. She can look after herself, thank you very much, but she eyes the bottle, and the vitamins, and the wad of notes on the desk by the window, and then, at last, her own abdomen, before she's reminded of the fact that she's pregnant, and she almost makes herself sick again. "Will you really?" she murmurs, uncharacteristically vulnerable as she unstops the vial. Callum offers her a smile. It's still nervous, and for the first time, Rayla realizes that he's just as scared of this she is, but it's warm, and it comforts her nonetheless. "Always," he promises. "Get some rest. I'll be here." Either she's exhausted and she needs it, or the antiemetic draft has some sort of sedative in it because Rayla passes out almost immediately after she takes it. Either way, Callum spends the rest of the afternoon sitting at the desk in her room, keeping watch over her as he tries to write his proposal for a curriculum for the scholars at the university. He'd told them it'd be done by tomorrow, he remembers, but as hard as he tries to concentrate, his mind wanders away from his work at every opportunity, and he doesn't need to be a genius to understand why. They're having a baby. They're having a baby. Callum had forgotten to think about the concept for himself in his effort to calm her down. It's only now, as he stares at the notes on the desk, that the realization hits him with its full force. They are having a baby, and while he can say he was legitimately terrified when the healer had told them, it's nothing compared to now. Now, all he can think about is the life growing in her belly, the danger of losing it, and of losing her, of what it would mean to raise a half-elf, half-human child in a world that's still not readily accepting of elf-human relations to begin with, of his ability to raise it at all. He's 19. Rayla's barely 20. Their wedding is in 2 weeks, and they are barely prepared for that, let alone raising a child, but despite it all, despite the fear and the anxiety that fills his chest at the thought of it, there's a part of him that wants to be excited. He'd never imagined a version of his future without children, and, as terrified as she is, Callum doesn't think Rayla's ever imagined a future without them either. They'd just never imagined they'd be expecting one so soon. He wonders what it might look like, if it's a girl or a boy, and if he or she might have his eyes and her hair, or his hands and her smile. He turns to his sketchbook, in the end, his work forgotten as he draws, not the child. There are too many possibilities for him to even fathom at this point, but Rayla as she sleeps, her hand resting absently against her abdomen as if she's already protective of the life growing within it. It makes him smile. They're having a baby, he reminds himself, and it doesn't feel like so scary a thought now. Maybe it's the way Rayla curls in on herself, her instinct to protect it present even in her sleep. Maybe he'll be the same. Maybe his own concerns will disappear if he just allows his own instinct to protect her and the baby help him in being a dad. Gods, it's a scary thought. Him. A dad. But it's exciting too, and he hopes that, when Rayla wakes, he'll find a way to convince her of it. Notes. Can't believe how supportive you guys are of this already. All right. Fine. I'll write the thing. Can't guarantee I'll do it as fast as I did Ada, but I'll do my best. Chapter 3. Summary. I can ride fine, she hisses. I can make it home without your help. I'm not an invalid. Chapter text. 3. They stay inland for a few more days. Rayla sleeps for most of it, much to her chagrin, but between throwing up every couple of hours and sleeping the day away, it's not hard to figure out which she prefers. Callum spends the time watching over her. He leaves once, to drop his proposal off at the university, declining invites for tours and cancelling meetings in favor of getting back to the inn as quickly as possible. When people ask, he tells them Rayla's sick, and they believe him because word has gotten around of her fainting spell the other day. That makes him grimace because he knows Rayla won't take kindly to it. It's a weakness, and weakness is not something she's ever been proud to show. He's glad their business is almost done here. She'll be more comfortable at home. He writes when he can and draws when he can't, and the wad of notes the healer gave them is crumpled and creased now from the 8 or 9 times he's already read through them just these past few days. He brings her clear soup and fresh bread from the kitchen downstairs, plain foods, nothing too aromatic that it might turn her stomach even with antiemetic draft. He'd brought her stew that first night, and just the smell had forced her into the bathroom once again, but on the day they are due to leave, she forgoes the draft entirely, determined to ride home on her own. She's a little green still, and a lot unsteady when she climbs onto Vorobei, but her jaw is set, her lips pressed into a stubborn line as she shakes the reins and eases the filly onto the road. "You're sure you're okay?" Callum asks, nudging his own mare, Kuritsa, into step with her. Rayla nods. "I'm fine," she says stiffly. "It's only a day's ride." "I know, but..." "I'm fine, Callum," she says sharply. She gives him a look, her face hard and obviously wanting nothing more than for this conversation to be over, and Callum sighs and says nothing else. She keeps her eyes on the horn of her saddle. He notices Vorobei's reins wrapped so tightly around her hands that the leather cuts into her skin. Her shoulders are tense, her back ramrod straight, her knees bent at a sharper angle than they are supposed to be. Rayla's a graceful rider on most days, but today, she's wearing all the signs of someone afraid they might fall off their horse, and Callum would know because he used to be routinely guilty of all of them. Vorobei's always been a clever horse, attuned to the way she rides and anticipating of what she means her to do, but even she seems uncomfortable with tension in Rayla's muscles. Her movements are jerky and awkward, and it only makes Rayla grip her reins tighter still. They are crossing a field of moon lilies a couple of hours from Lantha when the filly nickers and tosses her head. It's an attempt for some slack in her reins, but Rayla yelps and does the next worst thing, her hands flying into Vorobei's mane and forming fists in the hair. Callum's reaction is automatic. A fall from that height would be dangerous for anyone, let alone someone who's pregnant, and he slides off Kuritsa and scrambles in front of Vorobei, seizes the reins around her neck to give her the slack that she needs, and mutters words of comfort to her until Rayla steadies herself enough to get to the ground safely. She falls to her knees looking like she might be sick again, but she doesn't gag. She just breathes. It can't be easy, Callum thinks. She must feel awful, but there's nothing to do but wait for it to pass. He takes a skin of water off the edge of Kuritsa's saddle and hands it to her, dropping into the space at her side, wanting to offer comfort but not knowing how. In the end, he puts a hand on her knee and sighs. "You're okay," he murmurs, more to himself than to her. "Take your time. You're okay." Rayla says nothing at first. She's still trying to breathe the nausea away, the skin halfway to her lips before she manages to actually drink from it. "I'm fine," she croaks at last. I need a minute. I don't need you to hover." "I'm not hovering," says Callum quickly. "I'm just worried about you." "Well, don't." Her tone is short, clipped in a way that makes Callum wonder if he's done something wrong. "Hey," he starts, frowning, a little unsure where her animosity might be coming from. "I just want you to be okay." "I am," she snaps. She gets up, skin still in hand, wobbling dangerously as she does, and it only makes her scowl more. "I can get home on my own. I don't need you worrying over me." Callum steadies her, both out of habit and out of concern, but she shrugs his hand off her shoulder and clips the skin back onto Kuritsa's saddle. When she turns to mount Vorobei again, the filly brays and shifts away from her, still bothered by how tightly Rayla had pulled at her reins. She huffs, frustrated, and when she reaches for her a second time, she's much less gentle. The filly resists, tries to pull away from her, unused to the coarseness of her movements and growing more agitated the more frustrated Rayla gets. Callum senses the danger before it gets there. "Rayla, that's enough, you're scaring her." And he puts himself between them, easing the reins from Rayla's fingers and giving Vorobei some room. She scowls at them both, but its ferocity is lost in the way her face falters, a wave of nausea crossing her features once more. "Rayla, come on, you need to take it easy." She snarls at him. "I can ride fine," she hisses. "I can make it home without your help." I'm not an invalid. Understanding dawns on him, and he puts his hands on her shoulders and ducks his head so he can look her in the eye. She's frustrated, he realizes. She just wants to go home, to savor what privacy she can before the wedding throws them into the spotlight for the entire world to see, and before this pregnancy starts a scandal in the more conservative parts of the human kingdoms. She's sick of feeling tired from the antiemetic draft, and tired of feeling sick without it. She's angry that she can't even ride home without feeling like she might fall off her own horse, and, most of all, she's so scared of everything this pregnancy implies because she's been too sick or too sleepy to even talk about it the way they should already have. No one's calling you an invalid, he says gently. You can absolutely make it home on your own, I have no doubt in that, but we can slow down a little, okay? We'll get there, we will, but just take a minute to rest. If not for you then, for the baby. That stops her. She looks away, a grimace on her lips, guilty and uncertain and terrified, all at once. She says nothing for a while, and when she does, it's little more than a murmur. We should get going. It'll be nightfall before we get there if we don't make a move. Callum frowns at her. Rayla, wait, can we just talk about this for a second? Not right now, she mutters. I just want to go home. He lends her Kuritsa. The mare is gentler, and rather more forgiving than Vorobei, and afterwards, Callum leaves her to herself. She's not mad at him, she'll make that clear to him later, she promises herself. He has every right to worry over her and to want to hover, but there's a lot on her mind right now, and more than anything, she just needs space and time to think. It's not that she doesn't want children. She loves Callum with all her heart, and there's always been children in the futures she's imagined with him. She's just not sure that she's ready for this one. They ride in silence for most of the day. Twice, Rayla steers them off the road to take a breather, but she doesn't throw up anymore, which can only be a good sign. It's a little too optimistic to hope that the nausea's settling on its own already, but she hopes anyway. It's dusk when they cross under the gates of Kira. The familiar domed roofs and the moon carvings are a relief to her, and while her people are still wary of Callum, they've grown used to his presence. At least here, the stairs aren't so bad. Her stomach turns as she hops off Kuritsa, not because of the baby, but because of the odd sort of anxiety building in her system. What are we going to tell them, she asks Callum at last, as he follows suit and climbs off Vorobei. Callum blinks at her, but his lips tilt upwards, altogether pleased that she's talking again. Nothing, if you don't want them to know yet. The healer said to avoid telling people until after 12 weeks anyway. She snorts to herself. I think you might have been paying better attention than me, honestly. That, and I've read those notes about 1,000,000 times now. Tentatively, he reaches for her hand. Are we okay? We were always okay, mutters Rayla, and she presses a kiss into the back of his hand for good measure. I'm sorry about earlier. I'm a little. It's okay, he chuckles. You don't have to say it. I know. The smile he offers her then is comforting, and he squeezes her hand and pulls her close. Vorobei and Kuritsa follow them, both horses familiar enough with the path to her uncle's home to wander after them even without guidance. I know you're not ready to talk about it just yet, he says after a minute, but, when you are, I'll be here, okay? Please, just, take it easy. I don't want anything to happen to you. Either of you. Something about the way he says it warms her, and she smiles, in spite of herself. At least she knows he'll be a fantastic father. He's far too loving and considerate to be anything else. I'll be okay, she says finally. You don't have to worry. I will anyway, he says with a grin. You know that. It's Tinker who greets them. It's an odd nickname to Callum, but it's familiar, and it's nice that Tinker thinks of him as family enough to insist that he use it too. He's always been the nicer one, but that's not something he'll admit out loud. His smile wide as he pulls Rayla into a hug. Took your time, didn't you, he teases. We were expecting you earlier. Rayla grimaces a little at that. They would have arrived earlier, if they weren't riding so slow, and if she hadn't pulled them over twice to catch her breath, but Tinker doesn't need to know that. To Callum, he adds, Your Highness, with a low bow, and Callum grins sheepishly and holds up both hands. You know you don't have to do that. Formality dictates that I do, he says impishly. He ushers them both into the cottage and closes the door after them with a gentle thunk. We should get used to it, in any case. We'll be bowing to Rayla in a week's time. Don't even joke, says Rayla dryly. It's no joke, princess. Tinker. Tinker laughs, taking Callum's pack from him and setting it on a chaise in the living room. Ranan's upstairs, if you want to go and get him for dinner. The two of you must be famished. Your Highness, if you could help me with the table, I'd very much appreciate it. Sure, says Callum, a little awkwardly. Tinker's always been welcoming, but it's still weird to be left in the room with either him or Ranan without Rayla to act as a buffer. This visit is supposed to be quick. They are to set off again in the morning, all four of them, because Ranan wants to visit the Moon Nexus with Rayla as part of a tradition before her wedding, but it's not until Callum smells Zadian onions that he realizes the problem. Say, Tinker, what'd you make? Tinker blinks at him, bowls of stew in his hands. Winter stew, Rayla's favorite. Why? The prince. Callum blanches a little. He knows that drawl. He has all of a second to recover before Ranan makes himself apparent. His prosthetic arm is almost indiscernible, and Callum might not have realized that it was an illusion at all. He hadn't felt magic emanating from the charm at his belt. He smirks at him the way only a smug in-law might. Come to whisk my protege away for good, then. Only if she wants me to, says Callum. It's a poor attempt to be smooth, but it's Rayla that gets him. She's looking a bit green again, and she keeps her face carefully tilted away from both of her uncles as she presses her lips together in an effort not to gag at the smell. Tinker's too fast for her. Rayla. Are you all right? Fine, says Rayla quickly. I'm just not feeling so well. I'll be a minute. She ducks away before they have the chance to question her more, and Callum watches her go, wondering how long is appropriate to pretend to hesitate before he goes after her. When they look to him for answers a moment later, he decides that's long enough. He gets up. She's just a little under the weather. I'll go and check on her. You guys go ahead. I'll be right back. He hurries off too, but he waits until he hears the cutlery clinking before he sneaks back into the living room to take the antiemetic draft from his pack. Odd, he hears Tinker say. She's never rejected winter stew before. Callum winces. He hopes they haven't already blown their cover. Chapter 4. Summary. You've got a good one, Rayla. He just wants to take care of you. Let him. You'll both feel better for it. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. 4. They leave for the Moon Nexus just after dawn the next morning. It would have been earlier, should have been earlier, Rayla thinks. The wedding is only a week away now, and at this rate, they'll arrive in Katolis the day of, but there's only so much she can force herself to do. In the past, she might been able to push through it, but it's not just her anymore, and the nausea that hits her whenever she wakes, or whenever she smells anything remotely aromatic is a constant reminder of it. Dawn had found her dry heaving in the bathroom while Callum distracted her uncles, but there's a part of her that thinks, especially now as she rides alongside Ranan on Kuritsa, that they might not have a secret to keep in the first place. Ranan's not an idiot. He might not be an assassin anymore, but he's still just as observant, and just as perceptive, and it's a day and a half to the border still, and if he doesn't already know now, there's no doubt he'll know by the time they get to the Nexus. It's an ancient tradition, he'd told her. In the old days, before the war, and before the border had ever come into existence, Moon Shadow Elves gathered at the Nexus before weddings for a purification ritual, of sorts. They would drink from the spring to cleanse their bodies, and pray to the moon, and wish away the problems of their past so that they might start a future with their soon-to-be spouse entirely fresh. No one's done it at the Nexus in millennia, being on the other side of the border and all, but given the nature of her impending marriage to Callum, it feels appropriate. She'll be the first in a very, very long time to drink from the spring immediately before her wedding, and it's something Ranan wants to share with her in her final days as his protege, not that she'll ever stop being his protege, like she's told him 1,000 times already, but she understands. Ranan's closer to a father to her than an uncle. There'd been a time, before the war ended, when they'd thought they'd lost each other, and it's an experience that neither of them want to repeat. This is something special, something they can share without Callum, without Tinker, even. It's only right that she'll be the first to start the tradition again, and righter still that it's Rhiannon who takes her. It's just a matter of whether or not she can get up the mountain without being sick to begin with. The ride is slow. Slower than she'd like, and once or twice, Rhiannon and Tinker pull ahead only to have to wait for her and Callum to catch up a little while later. They study her surreptitiously, that is to say, not surreptitiously at all, and Rayla can practically feel the way they watch her when she pulls them off the road to catch her breath in the late afternoon. Callum, for his part, does an excellent job at deflecting their questions. He tells them that he'd made dinner just before they'd arrived in Kira and bears Tinker's dry humor with a sheepish grin when he accuses him of trying to poison his niece. Rhiannon is less amused, his apprehension around Callum especially obvious so close to the wedding. She imagines it's about the same as the way General Amaya still acts around her, not hostile at all, just a little hesitant. They stop for the night in a little town just past the border. There are elves here, which is nice to see, healers and troops that crossed to this side of the border after the war happily mingling with human merchants and smiths. The inn that they drop into is run by a man not too much older than them who recognizes Callum immediately. "Your Highness," he greets. "What an honor. I'm afraid my best rooms aren't available, but if you'd like them." "Please don't," chuckles Callum. "We're only staying the night. Any room is fine. 2 if you have them." "Of course, Your Highness," he says with a bow. "Can I get you anything else?" Callum shrugs, eyeing his companions with a small smile. "Just some dinner." And he pauses, waits for Rhiannon and Tinker to turn away for a moment before he leans across the reception desk and murmurs, "Some ginger tea, if you have any." It takes Rayla a second to realize the significance of his request, and even then, it's only when the innkeeper looks at her funny that she realizes what he's told him. She ducks her head, but the innkeeper only nods and doesn't ask questions. He brings them their food and Rayla her tea. With it, she gets through dinner without having to leave. But grateful as she is to Callum for his thoughtfulness, she waits until they are alone and in their room before she scowls at him and folds her arms across her chest. "What are you doing?" she hisses. "Ginger tea. At this rate, the whole continent's going to find out." Callum winces under her glare. "Sorry," he mutters. I thought it might help." "Thought it might help," she mocks. "Didn't it?" She falters. It did help, and she realizes, for the first time in days, how cranky she's been towards him. Callum's been nothing but thoughtful and considerate to her since the day they found out, and she's being unnecessarily hostile. He only wants her to be healthy. It's his baby too, after all. She scowls, angry at herself for allowing her hormones to get the better of her, but she says nothing else to him, reluctant to admit that he's right. Callum sighs, far more patiently than she deserves, and takes a seat beside her. "I get that you're scared, Rayla," he says quietly. "But I'm only trying to help. Can we please just talk about this?" "I'd rather we didn't," she grumbles. "We can't ignore it forever, Rayla." "We won't," she says shortly. It comes out colder than she intends and she relents. "Just after the wedding," she says finally. "Please." Callum smiles at her. It's supposed to be understanding, she thinks, but it only makes guilt settle in her stomach. He's too nice to her. Too patient, and too kind, and too understanding of the way she's been behaving. He presses a kiss into her knuckles. After the wedding, he agrees at last. "Are you going to be okay to get the Nexus tomorrow night?" Rayla snorts at him. "Don't really have a choice, do I? Rhiannon D understand, you know. They both would, if you told them." "Not yet," she mutters. "Just, not yet. X." The innkeeper brings her more tea in the morning. He's very sweet about it. He brings it to their door just before dawn, careful to avoid Rhiannon and Tinker as they make ready to leave this morning. "My wife's the same," he tells her quietly. "Your secret's safe with me, princess." "Please don't call me that," she mumbles, but she offers him a grateful smile and takes the tea without complaint. Things move at a better pace this morning. They leave on time, and Rayla can even ride a little faster, even if she is still riding Kuritsa. It puts them in the village at the base of the Moon Nexus in the early afternoon, and she takes a little time to catch her breath before she and Rhiannon make their way up to the mountain. The illusions on the way up make her chuckle, the memory of her first time here with Callum and Ezran and Ellis and Ava still clear even after all this time. They were so young. They'd fought off that giant leech on this path. Callum had done his stupid jerk-face dance over there. She pats Luyan's gigantic glowing spider on their way past, laughing at the way Ranan actually yelps when it jumps down from its web in front of him. They are just illusions, Ranan, she snickers as she leads him past. He bristles at that, but it's an otherwise good trip up the mountain because for the first time in days, Rayla doesn't feel sick, and she can pretend everything's normal and fine and that she's not pregnant with a baby she's not quite ready for. Having some space from Callum is nice too, he means well, and in all honesty, she thought he'd be worse, but the way he hovers makes the air around her feel stifling. She appreciates how much he cares, and she's grateful to him for letting her deal with this in her own time, but the time to herself is refreshing, and it's done wonders for her mood. Luyan meets them at the top of the mountain, her smile genuine as she bows to Rayla. Rayla she greets, or should I say princess? Don't, says Rayla sharply, but she smiles nonetheless. You knew we were coming. I wondered if you would, she admits. And I saw you on your way up. Come to re-establish an old tradition. You bet, chuckles Rayla. She ushers Ranan forward. This is Ranan. Ranan, this is Luyan, guardian of the Moon Nexus. An honor, says Ranan, inclining his head just a little. The honor's all mine, says Luyan. Come. I'll show you to the spring. X. She leads them to a fountain, nestled between the two statues overlooking the lake. The stone is worn and ancient, the carvings in the base smoothed by millennia of running spring water. There's a chalice sitting beneath it, tarnished with age but still gleaming in the pale moonlight as it catches the stream. It's water from the lake, Luyan tells them. Blessed by the moon every month at its fullest. In the old days, they used to bathe in it, to wash away impurity like you might wash dirt off your skin. Then they would drink, to cleanse the soul and to physically imbibe the moon's blessing. Most people only drink, nowadays. Others have water poured over their heads and shoulders in a half version of the tradition, and not even from the spring. You'll be the first to have that in a very long time. So I've been told, says Rayla with a half smile. There's no obligation to do either, says Ranan, anticipating her hesitation. If you'd prefer the privacy to bathe, I can wait for you in the ruins. Rayla shakes her head. The half version is fine, she mumbles quietly. Of course, says Luyan with a smile. She motions for Rayla to step closer and takes the chalice from the base. Ranan, if you would. Ranan nods. Rayla wonders if he's done this before, because there's surety in his words as he fills the chalice and holds it over her head. I ask for the blessing of the moon on this elf, my niece and protege, soon to be wed to the human prince of Katolis. I pray their partnership is filled with love and companionship, honesty and integrity, and that the children they may have might be blessed with the same. I wash you now, with the water of the moon, so you might enter your marriage clean and pure and whole. He pours the water over her head, and Rayla winces as cold runs over her face and shoulders. When he's done, he fills it again and hands it to her. And may you drink so your soul is just as clean. Rayla does. The chalice is just as cold on her lips, and she shudders as the water slips down her throat. Then it's done. Luyan claps her hands together quietly, her smile wide and pleased, before she claps both their shoulders and disappears to fetch Rayla a towel. Stay as long as you need, she bids them before she goes. It's been a while since the Nexus has had visitors that understand its sacredness. No offense to your friends, Rayla. Rayla snorts at that, but Luyan's gone before she can offer any sort of response, and it's just her and Ranan, alone on the bank of the caldera. A moment passes, and then another, before he leads her down to the water's edge and takes a seat against the flat stones. Are you ready, then, he asks her. As I'll ever be, I guess, says Rayla with a shrug. She joins him when he motions for her to, his eyes wistful and far away. Perhaps he's reminiscing on her parents' wedding. Perhaps his own and Tinker's. She's not entirely sure, but there's something unreadable there as he looks out over the lake. Not for the wedding, he says. For what comes after. The life you're to share with your prince and all it entails. Rayla's lips twitch a little at that. It's not that different from what we've been doing already, she admits to him. Ezran's been calling us an old married couple since before he even arranged our marriage. We fight, and we argue, and we get on each other's nerves, but we love each other. We trust each other with our lives. There's no one else I'd rather be with. Raanan scoffs at her. You're very smitten with him, aren't you? Only as much as you're smitten with Tinker, she says with a smirk. He smirks back. I'm happy for you, Rayla, he says quietly. For all the jokes I make at the expense of your prince, I'm pleased it's him and not anyone else. He cares for you a great deal. I imagine that's why he went out of his way this morning to ask the innkeeper where to get you more ginger tea. Rayla stares at him, her face pale, her heart suddenly beating wildly in her throat. You don't have to explain yourself, says Raanan. I'm not so foolish I would expect my niece to be virginal when she's spent so long living in such close quarters to her beloved. He snorts and rolls his eyes at her. You turned your nose up at Tinker's winter stew, and you've been riding your prince's considerably gentler mare. Did you really expect me not to know? I hoped you wouldn't, mumbles Rayla, although in all fairness, he was going to find out one way or another. How far along are you? She sucks in a breath. 7, 8 weeks now. A little more, I think. I haven't really been keeping track. Raanan pauses. Studies her and the little grimace on her lips with a frown before he sighs. Your mother was the same, he tells her mildly. She was terrified of you. For a lot of reasons, but I think most of all, she was afraid of failing as a parent. But when you came into the world, she held you as much as she could when she could, and when she couldn't, she begged me to do it in her stead. She did her best, all things considered, and she loved you with all her heart. That's really all anyone can do when they are faced with the prospect of a child. Rayla sighs as well, her breath just shy of shaky as it leaves her lungs. You make it sound easy, she mutters. It's not, laughs Raanan. Believe me, you were a handful and I don't imagine your child will be any less. But it's something look forward to, rather than something to be afraid of. You're not doing it alone, after all. You've got your prince. Yeah, mumbles Rayla. I've been unfair to him lately. And still, he loves you and goes out of his way to make sure you and the baby will be okay. Raanan smiles at her. You've got a good one, Rayla. He just wants to take care of you. Let him. You'll both feel better for it. They lapse into a pause. Rayla twiddles her thumbs and stares at her abdomen, for once not violently afraid of the life there. She puts her hand against it, wondering how big it is and how it's growing, and when she looks up at last, she finds Raanan watching her fondly. You're taking this really well, she tells him, a little surprised. How else should I take the idea of a grandchild, he says. Even if its father is a human prince. It comes out like a sneer, but Rayla's not fooled. Her lips twitch into a smirk. You don't dislike him that much. Don't tell your prince that, he says. He's not to know that he has my approval. I rather enjoy making him nervous. Notes. 1. LOL, this feels like a mess, but I really wanted to explore Raanan's relationship with Rayla and I wanted to have a play with the idea of pre-wedding Moonshadow Elf traditions. I imagine a lot of Moonshadow Elves sort of felt like the Nexus being on the human side of the border was a little bit of a loss, but they are working on human-elf relations now. It only makes sense for Rayla to do a cool traditional thing to sort of reclaim it. 2. I'm trying really hard to stop making self-deprecating jokes. PC, imagine my surprise when I actually convinced myself that no one was enjoying this, even when your comments specifically told me otherwise. It made it really hard to write, which is why there was a delay. I hope you guys are having fun. It's a little hard to tell sometimes, but I can only stay positive and push through, haha. Chapter 5. Summary. People spend their whole lives waiting to be ready, Claudia tells her gently. They never realize that they are until they're there. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. V. The morning of the wedding, the nausea hits Rayla so hard that she barely even makes it to the bathroom. They'd gotten into Katolis late last night. It was foolish of her to think she could hide something like a pregnancy from Raanan and Tinker, but it meant, at least, that they were a little more understanding of the slow mornings and of the frequent stops. The ginger tea helps a little, Callum had found a tin of it in a little town on their way back to the city, and while it's not quite as effective as the anathematics the healer from Lantha had given them, it means she doesn't spend the whole day too drowsy to function. She sleeps in Callum's room, usually, or at least she has been since Ezran made their engagement official, but she's on the other side of the castle today. Human traditions insist that Callum's not supposed to see her until the ceremony, which would be fine, she thinks, if circumstances were different. Right now, she's too sick to even crawl to the doorway to ask one of the castle maids for a mug of hot water for her tea. It's probably a combination of things. She's 9 weeks along now, and Callum's notes say that the Norsea's not supposed to settle for at least another month yet, which, alone, makes Rayla want to hit something. But not only that, it's her wedding day today and she's, understandably, a little nervous. Not of the idea of spending the rest of her life with Callum, she'd happily do that in a heartbeat, but there's a lot of pomp that goes with it that she's not sure she's cut out for. She's not exactly the most conventional choice for a princess. The fact that she's vomiting into the toilet because of the halfling baby in her belly is proof of that. She's still unsure about this, but it's a lot better than it was. Ranan's words stick with her. She keeps them in her mind to remind herself that, moon shadow elf or not, it's perfectly reasonable to be scared. Her own mother was. Ranan was when he'd found out he was to take her in. Most of all, she tries to remember that she's not doing this alone. It's Callum's baby too, and he's not about to let her do it all by herself. There's plenty of evidence of that in the way he hovers around her already. She's trying to be a little fairer to him about it. He means well and he has been helping, not so much in the way he thinks he is, but in his anticipation of the way her mood swings and in his patience and understanding of it. She'd promised him they'd have that talk after the wedding and she'd meant it, but she's still a little nervous around the idea. Talking about it makes it real. There's a part of her that's still not ready, that still can't even process it, and that conversation will destroy any and all of her pretenses around the concept of her being a mother. It's a terrifying thought, even now. Someone knocks against the bedroom door, she thinks. It's hard to tell over the sound of her own retching. My lady, she hears. It's one of the guards, probably. She doesn't even have it in her to grimace at the title. Are you all right? She tries to tell him she's fine, but the nausea hits again and she heaves once more. When the knocking comes again, it's accompanied by a different voice, one more familiar and much more welcome. Rayla. Claudia calls, her voice muffled by the thick wood. Can I come in? Groaning, Rayla picks herself up off the bathroom floor and stumbles back out into the bedroom, tripping a little over her own feet as she goes. She opens the door to a grinning Claudia, 2 mugs of that hot brown morning potion in her hands, excited twinkle in her eye. Rayla imagines her enthusiasm would be infectious any other day, but the smell wafting out of those mugs makes her stomach reel, and, instead, she gags and staggers wordlessly back into the bathroom. Claudia frowns after her, her grin faltering as she sets both mugs on Rayla's nightstand. "Are you okay?" Peachy mutters Rayla, her eyes shut tight as she tries to steady her breathing. "Nerves." "Sure." She hears Claudia let out a breath of chuckle. "I get it," she says gently, moving to hold Rayla's hair back for her. "But there's nothing to be nervous about. You're marrying Callum. Everything's going to go fine." "Ugh." Rayla wipes her mouth off with the back of her hand and eases back. She means to say something witty, or to thank Claudia at the very least. It's sweet of her to be so reassuring, but there's a little more than that on her mind right now. "It's not him I'm worried about," she manages hoarsely. "What, you think the people might still be iffy about you marrying him?" Claudia waves a dismissive hand at her, a snort slipping from her lips. "Rayla, the last time someone tried to start a scandal about this, Callum punched them in the face. It's going to be fine." Despite herself, Rayla's lips twitch at the memory. He still has the scar on his knuckle from where he'd nicked his fist against Balan's teeth, but it's a scar he's proud to have. It eases her stomach enough for her to crawl away from the toilet and to the satchel at the foot of the bed. Claudia watches her curiously, following her back out into the bedroom and reaching for her mug. She offers Rayla the second, but the sight of it makes her scowl. "Keep that away from me." Her frown deepens. "Are you sure this is just nerves?" "It absolutely isn't," Rayla thinks inwardly, but she keeps her lips pressed closed in a poor effort to keep this secret just a little bit longer. There's suspicion growing in Claudia's eyes already. It's only a matter of time before she figures it out for herself. It's nothing, Rayla tells her at last. It's fine. I'm fine. I'm just really nervous. Oh, okay. Claudia's still frowning, but she takes a sip from her mug and shrugs. Can I get you anything to help or? Rayla's immediate response is almost no, because there's nothing she can do, really, but she still needs hot water and she's not exactly in a fit state to get it herself. Just hot water, she mumbles, her fingers finding the tin of ginger in her satchel. For, like, a bath or tea. Claudia stares at her. Her eyes have gone from suspicious to calculating, like she's counting up all of Rayla's symptoms and doing the math in her head. What kind? My own, says Rayla sharply as she can with bile still in her throat anyway. She winces, knowing how defensive she sounds, a part of her wondering how she's ever managed to tell a lie in her life. She ducks her head, tapping her fingers against the lid of the tin, her arm buried up to her elbow in the satchel. I've got some up here. I can brew it on my own. What, is it ginger root or something? It's obviously a joke, and there are ways to get out of this without telling her, but Rayla looks away too quickly, and the next thing she hears is Claudia's mug hitting the ground. Her hot brown morning potion splashes over her boots, spilling over the floor, the cracks in the stones filling with brown fluid, and when Rayla looks up again, Claudia looks as if she's forgotten how to work the muscles in her face. Oh, she breathes, her eyes wide, her jaw unhinged in a way that makes her look a little like a stunned fish. She takes the second mug and tosses its contents into the drain in the bathroom, washes it out with water from the pump, and ducks her head out the door. Fill this with hot water, she tells the nearest guard. Don't give me that look. Would you be hesitating if it was Prince Callum who asked? Her ladyship will be your princess this afternoon. Don't keep her waiting. She hands the mug off entirely, and when she pulls her head back in again, she slams the door shut after her, her eyes still wide, her back pressed against the door. As sick as she feels, as unprepared for this pregnancy as she is, Rayla can't help the sardonic little smirk that tugs at her lips. Does Callum know? Yeah. How long? Rayla looks away again. 9 weeks. A pause falls between them. Claudia's gape turns into something more of a frown, like she's trying to decide whether congratulations or condolences might be more appropriate. Are you happy about it? Rayla takes in a breath. It's complicated, she mutters. There's been a lot going on with the wedding, so we haven't really had the chance to talk about it. She pauses. Studies Claudia's face carefully before she continues. What do you think? Honestly. The corners of Claudia's lips tilt upwards, and she steps over the puddle of hot brown morning potion at her feet to take a seat next to Rayla. I think it's wonderful, she says quietly. I get it, though. I think maybe if this was just a common law marriage, it might be less scary, but you know how court people can be, and I think you'd be silly to not be worried about how they might react. Admittedly, I'm a little nervous for you too. But Rayla, can you imagine it? A baby, a tiny version of you and Callum, a living, breathing example of everything the two of you have been working for. Gods, it's exciting. Well, I'm glad one of us thinks so, says Rayla dryly. I'm still a little caught up on the worried part. She fiddles with the tin, her eyes on her abdomen, wondering what sort of world her little one might grow up in, if it'll be dogged by rumors and scandal wherever it goes, or if it might be shunned for what it is. I'm scared, Claudia, she admits at last, her voice barely louder than a whisper. It's the first time she's said those words out loud to anyone about this, and they come out in a rush. I don't know that I'm ready to be a mother. I don't know that we'll have made enough of a difference for it to grow up happy. Maybe if we'd waited, if we'd had a little more self-control, things might be better. People spend their whole lives waiting to be ready, Claudia tells her gently. They never realize that they are until they're there. And you know what Alis likes to say. Change doesn't come about by waiting, Rayla murmurs. Claudia smiles at her, properly this time, without the nervousness on her behalf. Tentatively, she reaches over to squeeze one of Rayla's hands, holding it tight within hers until Rayla feels her nerves settle and squeezes back. It's amazing how far they've come in such a short time. They'd never hated each other, they just had a lot of differences that, once upon a time, Rayla wasn't sure they could get past. Things are different now, and it's not the first time Rayla's been so grateful of her support. "Are you okay?" she asks finally. "Okay enough to get married today, I think," Rayla says, breathless, a tiny smile tugging at the corners of her lips, but her stomach churns again when she tries to get up. She groans. "Tea first, though. I'd rather not throw up on Callum." X. The day passes in dollops. First she's putting on her dress, a human ball gown with elven patterns embroidered in silver on the bodice and skirt, while Claudia pins flowers into her hair. Then she's standing next to Callum, his eyes soft as councilwoman Opali binds their hands. Then they're waving at the masses, rings on their fingers shining in the afternoon sun. Then they're in the ballroom, dancing their first dance and laughing with their friends and family. It's altogether a good day, and while Rayla doesn't even touch the wine, she finds herself drunk on the atmosphere and the spirit of things, her smile growing wider as the night wears on. Whenever Callum looks at her, he grins, pleased to be hers by the law of his land at last, happy to hold her close and call himself her husband in a way that makes her giggle and blush like a teenager with a crush. In all fairness, it wasn't that long ago that she was one, and as innocent and as unproblematic and unpolitical those days were, she prefers this. When they finally get some time alone that night, after Callum helps her out of her dress and she tugs him out his suit, he puts a hand against her belly and sighs into her hair. "I know it's been a long day," he whispers. "But do you think we can talk about this now?" Rayla hesitates, but she thinks about her talk with Claudia and her talk with Ranan and laces her fingers with his. "If you want," she murmurs. "We don't have to keep it." His voice is soft, barely a whisper, and Rayla blinks, shifting in the bed to face him. It's not what she thought he'd open with. He wants this baby, it's obvious in his every action and in the very way he looks at her. He wants this child and he's ready to raise it, and she frowns and brushes his hair out of his eyes. "Why would you suggest that?" He shrugs. "I know you don't think you're ready for it," he tells her. "And I get it, being a dad is scary to me too, but I just want you to know that we don't have to do it, if you don't want to. I don't want to force you into being a mother if you're not ready to be just yet. There are safe ways to go about it, especially this early on. If you don't want it, just say the word." The thought of it is like a slap in the face. As terrified as she is, she doesn't think she's ever considered it. It hadn't even occurred to her that aborting this pregnancy was a possibility, and now, knowing that it is, Rayla shakes her head. "We're not getting rid of it," she says firmly. I don't think getting rid of it was ever even an option." "Rayla, you don't have." "I know I don't. But, if you're asking me what I want, then I want to keep it." She pauses, the words feeling new in her mouth, but strangely right, like it is what she wants and she's only just realized it. "I want to keep it," she says again, slower this time, like she's savoring the way it sounds in her own voice. I was scared, Callum. I'm still scared. I'm terrified of the very concept of being a mother, and of the world it might have to grow up in, but Claudia said something today that made it less scary." "Claudia?" Callum raises an eyebrow at her. "She figured it out," Rayla tells him. "She was never not going to. The morning sickness was too much of a giveaway." Callum chuckles, his lips tilted upwards in a charming smile, the green of his eyes filling with hope. "What'd she say?" Rayla breathes in. "That people are never ready until they're there," she says, staring up at the canopy of their bed thoughtfully. "She's right. I might not ever feel ready, but I won't ever be if we get rid of it. And, more than that, it's half you. How can I want to rid the world of something half you? I dunno, I can be pretty annoying." He grins at her earnestly, his palm warm against her belly. "Rayla, are you sure about this?" She laughs. "Not in the least," she says. "But I'm sure about you. You're already in love with this child, and I can only assume it'll mean you'll make a fantastic father. And I'm still scared, but I'm more scared of the idea of not having it at all. That's got to mean I love it too, at least a little, right?" "I think so," says Callum. He shuffles down in the bed awkwardly, until he's lying on his stomach beside her, his face level with her belly. "What do you think, Bobby?" Think me and your mom are going to be okay parents? Rayla lets out a laugh, warmth blooming in her chest as Callum presses an ear to the taut skin of her abdomen. I'm not sure you're going to get a definitive answer anytime soon, husband of mine, she teases. I think you're underestimating our baby, my darling wife. He grins at her, pressing a kiss against her belly the way only a doting father-to-be could, his smile almost too wide for his face. We're having a baby, Rayla. Yeah, she whispers, the terrifying, exhilarating reality of it settling in her bones at long last. We are. Notes. Still trash over Rayla and Claudia's potential friendship fight me. Also, some people may have noticed that I'm no longer on the Raylum Discord. There's too many of you guys and you all move too fast for me. BC, I'm fucking 80 on the inside, face with tears of joy, sorry to disappear on you. I just can't keep up with you all. Chapter 6. Summary. The little moonbeam and I are going to be fine, she promises him. But, if it'll make you feel better, fine. We can go talk to Ezran. Okay. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. Part 2. 6. The plan is to stay in Katolis for a few weeks. After all the running around for the wedding, and because he doesn't think they've ever had a real holiday ever, Callum quite frankly thinks they deserve it. They've worked hard these past 4 years, and one off day every couple of weeks isn't much of a break. In any case, Rayla hasn't seen anyone about the baby since that day in Lantha, and knowing now that she wants it, he feels like finding a healer or a midwife they can get to know and trust is something of an imperative. Rayla's not the most fond of the idea. She doesn't like being coddled, even by him, and having a stranger poke and prod at her is not at all appealing. She puts it off for as long as she can, but a week after the wedding, 10 weeks into her pregnancy, the morning sickness hasn't gone away, and the fact that she's been living off clear soups and fresh bread is becoming concerning. Your notes literally say this is normal, she groans one morning. You told me it won't go away for another few weeks yet. I just don't know that you should be this sick this often, Callum says, frowning as he holds back her hair. Anything even a little aromatic sets you off, even with your tea, and if you're throwing up this much, there's a pretty high chance you might not be getting the vitamins you need to keep yourself and the little one healthy. I think you're worrying too much. I think you just don't want to see a midwife. Very perceptive, well done. Rayla heaves once more, but when nothing leaves her, she shudders and leans her back against his knees. You know what will happen if we go asking for a healer or midwife? Callum grimaces because he does. The castle guards and staff are notoriously bad at keeping secrets, and the very act of asking around would start rumors so volatile that this baby will be public information long before they are ready for it to be. They've barely been married a week. News of the prince and princess of Katolis looking for a midwife already would be gossip too suggestive for anyone to resist. Callum purses his lips. He helps Rayla off the floor and leads her back into their bedroom, brews her tea for her with magic, and puts it in her hands with a kiss to her forehead. We should at least talk to Ezran about it. Surely there's someone on his staff who can help. She gives him a look, obviously reluctant to tell anyone else just yet, but he remembers, too late, that it doesn't matter. He knows, Rayla, he admits sheepishly. What? He was going to find out anyway, says Callum. And it's not like I told him, he figured it out at the wedding when he realized you weren't drinking the wine. Besides, he's my brother. He's your brother now too. He'll want to help. Rayla groans, her head lolling backwards in resignation. Is there anyone else who knows? She grumbles. Do we have a secret to keep at all? It's just Ezran, Callum tells her. And Claudia, and your uncles. No one we don't trust. He clutches at her fingers, her hands warm from the way she's been cupping her tea, and presses them to her lips, grinning at the way his mother's ring gleams at him in the sunlight. I just wanna be sure that everything's going the way it's supposed to be. I don't want anything to happen to you, or the little moonbeam. Moonbeam. His grin widens. We've gotta call it something. I didn't wanna start suggesting names until, Callum pauses. His notes say that the first trimester is the riskiest, that Rayla's first 12 weeks hold the highest chance of bleeding or miscarriage, and that they should wait until after the worst is over before they tell anyone else. he's known about this child 3 weeks, and the idea of anything happening to it or Rayla is already unthinkable. Understanding dawns on Rayla's features, her skull fading, her eyes softening as she studies him. She squeezes his hand back, the tiniest of smiles tugging at her lips, before she gets up and reaches for her vest and belt. The little moonbeam and I are going to be fine, she promises him. But, if it'll make you feel better, fine. We can go talk to Ezran. Okay. Okay. Callum chuckles, more relieved about it than he wants to admit, and presses her fingers to his lips once more. Ezran's thrilled, obviously. He had been at the wedding, but Callum's panic had tempered him. Even then, he'd looked ready to burst at the seams in his excitement, but now, in the privacy of his study, he's grinning from ear to ear and bouncing on the balls of his feet, because there's only one thing this conversation can be about, and he's very clearly ready for it to be more than just an implication. Callum rolls his eyes, glancing at Rayla with an amused smirk, wanting to be sure that it's okay to discuss this with Ez, even now. She shrugs, patient little smile playing at her lips. Go on, then, she says. Callum takes a breath. So, he begins a little awkwardly. It feels so strange to tell someone in actual words that, for a moment, he doesn't know how to go about it. The people who know had all figured it out on their own, and they've never actually had to say the words we're and, having and, a baby in the same sentence to anyone else. But Ez waits anyway, his eyes wide, his grin wider, his entire being tense and anticipant with a joy he won't let himself actually feel until they give them the go-ahead. So Callum does. We're having a baby, he says at last. Ezran lets out a cry, shrill and ecstatic, laughing as he lunges at the two of them, his arms open wide to embrace them both. Callum thinks he hears something that sounds like, I'm so happy for you both, followed by, I can't believe I'm gonna be an uncle, before he remembers what they are here for to begin with and pries his brother off of them. You can't tell anyone yet, says Rayla, her smile still just a tiny bit nervous but otherwise amused. I'm only, 10 weeks, finishes Callum. Look, Ez, we haven't seen anyone about it since we found out a few weeks ago, but we're not exactly ready for this to be public information just yet. We need to find a healer or a midwife we can trust who'll be discreet about it. Ez takes a second, rubs his cheeks trying to unfix his smile, but it hardly falls even as he asks his next question. Is there anyone else who knows? My uncles, Rayla says, and Claudia. They all figured it out, she adds, catching his pout. The only reason you weren't the first to know is because you didn't have to watch me throw up every morning. If it helps, you're the first one we've actually told. I'll forgive you, I guess. Ez sighs in pretend disdain, but his grin is still wide and ridiculous. Why don't you go see Eleni's midwife, then, he offers. There's a clinic in the south quadrant of the city where they are all sort of uniquely qualified, especially for this. They are very professional. You could probably go and see them this afternoon, although, if you want to keep it quiet for a little while longer, probably don't go together. Callum deflates. He'd wanted to be there. He'd wanted to be there with her for all of this, even if it is just as small as her first real prenatal appointment, but even more than that, she's their princess now. He's not stupid enough to believe that it's safe for her to be wandering the streets of Katolis on her own, even if he knows full well that she can take care of herself. Katolis might be the most progressive city of the Pentarchy, but there's still resistance to her presence here. There will be more when their people find out they're expecting. Rayla must notice the way his face falls, because she rolls her eyes and prods his cheek. You can miss one appointment, Callum. That's not it, he grumbles. It's risky, that's all. She gives him a look. It's the one thing they haven't really touched on in their talks about the logistics of being ambassadors and having a baby, mostly because he thinks Rayla doesn't want to acknowledge it. She doesn't like being coddled, but her condition sort of requires it, and as much as she wants to believe she's still invincible, the honest truth is that the baby is not. She opens her mouth to protest. Callum can already hear the words "I'm not defenseless," Callum long before they leave her, but Ez cuts in before they ever have the chance. I have an idea, he says, sensing the way her hackles are rising. Claudia knows, right? What if she just has the midwife meet you at the Wishbone? It's probably not the most ideal, and it means you'll have to tell Aelus and his family, but it'll be safe there. Plus, you've both been seen coming and going from Ayla's shop enough that it won't be suspicious if you go together. He looks between them, understanding of both perspectives and more patient than any 14-year-old should have the right to be. Would that be okay? Rayla bristles, her arms crossed over her chest, reluctant to tell more people even if they are friends they know they can trust, but she knows they're right, and in the end, she sighs. I suppose that'd be better than waiting in a clinic, she mutters. It would be, says, his grin returning. Besides, I know you guys didn't get to spend a lot of time with them at the wedding. It'll be nice. X. It is nice. Eleni greets them at the counter with a smile, baby Turin in a sling at her front, Lessa scampering happily out of the back room when she hears their voices in the shop. Your Highnesses, she says, curtsying, even as Rayla waves her off and crouches to say hi to Lessa. Our congratulations to you both. Thanks, says Callum, looking sheepish. Sorry to have to do this here. It's no problem, chuckles Eleni, stepping out from behind the counter. Turin shifts in the sling, and Callum grins, his own cluckiness getting the better of him. We're happy to have you here. Lessa, sweetie, you wanna give Her Highness some room? She's gonna have a baby too. Lessa pauses. She steps back from Rayla, her hand slipping into her mother's as she looks her up and down the way only a 4-year-old could, her forehead furrowed in a confused frown. Where are you keeping it? Is it in your belly? Ah, yeah. Rayla flushes, still a little hesitant about talking about it so frankly. It's very small. Smaller than you, even, it's got some growing to do yet. Can I feel it? There's nothing to feel yet, honey, says Eleni patiently. It's too small, remember. Sorry, she adds to them. She's been excitable since the wedding. Why don't you two go on upstairs? Help yourselves to the tea. I'll send Claudia and Rowena up when they get here. She ushers Lessa forward, whispers for her to go with them, and Lessa nods eagerly, taking Rayla's hand again to tug her up the spiral staircase into Ayla's and Eleni's apartment. Callum follows after them, but not without booping Turin's tiny button of a nose on his way past. Not for the first time, he wonders what their baby might look like when it's born, and he grins as he steps onto the landing. Can it be a girl? Lessa's asking. I hope it's a girl. I wanted a sister. A brother's not so bad, says Rayla, laughing. King Ezran and Prince Callum are brothers. Look how well they get along. They're both boys, whines Lessa. Turin's okay, but I still want a sister. Rayla snorts. No promises, she says, shifting over in the chaise for Callum. He joins her then, scooping Lessa into his lap to distract her from Rayla, and they are waiting up there for maybe 10 minutes before someone else steps onto the upstairs landing. Rowena is young for a midwife, younger than them, even, but her surcoat bears the symbol of the clinic she works at, and she smiles at them and adjusts the strap of the satchel at her shoulder. Your Highnesses, she greets, curtsying. My gosh, what an honor. Don't call me that, please, says Rayla. Thank you for coming to us. It's my pleasure, Your Highness, Rowena says. She puts her satchel down and opens it, sets her tools out on the table with the precision of someone who's been doing this for years, but when she turns to Rayla, she pauses, her age showing in the awkwardness of her smile. Why don't we start with some baseline things, she says. If that's all right, Your Highness. She's so nervous that Callum almost laughs. She means well, and she obviously knows what she's doing, but it's the fact that it's them that's getting to her. Rayla does her best to remove that pressure, asking her twice more to stop referring to them as Your Highnesses before giving up entirely with an exasperated smile and letting Rowena do as she wants. She takes some measurements, Rayla's current weight and blood pressure, puts her fingers to her belly with a tape measure to take a fundal height. It's early still, but I imagine you'll be away again soon, so I'll take whatever I can get now, she tells them, records it all in a little notebook, and when she's done, she packs her things again, sits them both down at the table, and clasps her hands in front of her. Everything's looking to be where it should be, she says happily, but her face falls just a little. I don't mean to scare you, Your Highnesses, but it is a dangerous time. The first 12 weeks are always the worst, so it's important you pay close attention to what your body needs and wants. Ideally, you should try to see me at least once a month, but I know that's asking for a little much, especially because you're away so often. At least try to see me whenever you're in the city. After that, the tricky part is the actual delivery, and I'm sure you don't need me to tell you how often mom and baby don't make it. She purses her lips, and Callum takes a breath. No. He doesn't need to be told. He reaches for Rayla's hand. Rowena smiles. We do good work at our clinic, she tells them. Since your engagement, we've had a few elf-human couples come to us, and they've all done really well. We'll look after you, when the time comes, but until then, please don't be too worried. There's nothing worse for the baby than a worried mom. For now, just take it easy. Pay attention to yourself. See someone if anything changes or if anything's worrying you. I've heard, Princess, that you're not overly fond of being taken care of, but if there was ever a time for it, it's now. Rayla breathes out a sigh. I suppose, she mutters. Morning sickness. It should go away by week 12, says Rowena. The best I can recommend is ginger tea, because anything actually medicinal will put you to sleep. We figured that one out on our own, snorts Callum. Thank you, Rowena, he says finally. My pleasure, she says with a grin. When do you think you might be able to see me again? We're here for a couple more weeks, Rayla tells her. We'll see you again before we go. That would be good, she says, nodding. I'll see you then, I suppose. Your Highnesses. She curtsies deeply, waves her fingers at Lesser, and smiles once more before she heads back down the stairs. Callum waits until she's gone before he lets out the breath he's holding and squeezes Rayla's hand. It's been mostly excitement until now, the thought of meeting their baby drowning away a fair amount of his fear of the actual delivery, but the reality of it hits him like a punch to the gut. Childbirth is dangerous. It's not an enemy they can defend against. It's not something they can defeat. It's a part of life. In some parts of the Pentarchy, where there are fewer elven healers, 1 in 3 mothers still die, and while Katolis is not one of those places, it still scares him. We've got a long way to go before then, Callum, Rayla murmurs, kissing the back of his hand. Everything's going to be fine. I know it will be, he says. He hopes so, anyway. He's not really sure what he'll do if it's not. On the outskirts of the city, a rumor is started. The Prince and Princess of Katolis saw a midwife today. It was supposed to be discreet, but the eyes and ears of the common folk are difficult to fool. The tavern is crowded tonight, but crowded taverns are often the easiest place to converse without being overheard. What do you want me to do? Asks the informant. Nothing for now, says the man in the corner of the bar, his hood pulled high over his head. Spread the word. Watch the midwife. The informant snorts, drinking deeply from his mead. Is that all? The hooded man huffs, watching the way his drink swills around in his tankard. I'm sure I don't need to tell you that our prince and princess can be dangerous when they want to be. Any move we make must be precise, and no one is to move until I say so. Is that understood? The informant shrugs and takes a drink. If you say so, he says. General notes. Some things. 1. Disclaimer, I am not a midwife. I am a scientist. I only ever talk to pregnant women to give them their anti-D if they are rhesus negative, and my involvement in a prenatal care is to have blood ready in my blood bank in case someone starts bleeding uncontrollably. I only sort of know what I'm talking about. Apologies for any inaccuracies. Rowena's baseline notes. In my defense, it's medieval fantasy, okay? 2. This was always supposed to be cute, but on the 20-minute drive home from work last night, it grew a plot, so guess we're doing that now. I feel like the political climate of Katolis needs addressing anyway, especially BC of Callum and Rayla's recent marriage. God, I hope this doesn't suck. Honestly team, I'm sorta winging it at this point. Whether or not this pans out is entirely unknown. Chapter 7. Summary. Bubs there, she murmurs. Not very big, but they're all the same. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. 7. It's a long couple of weeks. Callum's been careful around her since they found out to begin with, but Rowena's words make him even more so. His touch is softer than it ever has been, featherlight, even in their most private moments, especially in their most private moments, like he's afraid he might break her if he's the slightest bit too fast or too rough. Rayla gets it, but the hormones that come with pregnancy do not. She's been rather more passionate lately, and it would be fine, she thinks, if Callum didn't treat her like she was made of glass. He means well, and it still feels good, but it's not what she wants, and it's frustrating. She's pregnant, but she won't break. She tries to be patient, he just doesn't want to push too far too quickly, and she can't really be annoyed at him for that, but in between that and the morning sickness, she's been noticeably moodier about it. That is until the tail end of her 11th week, when she wakes up one morning, washes up, and dresses, and realizes that she's just moody. She pauses in her routine, purses her lips at herself in the mirror, eyes narrowed suspiciously at the almost imperceptible swell in her belly, hesitant to get her hopes up too early. Is this for real? She asks it. Are you done making me sick every morning? There's no answer, obviously, but Callum pauses in the bedroom, his shirt halfway done up, his brow furrowed in an amused little frown. Are you talking to the baby? I might be, says Rayla. Her eyes are still narrowed, but her lips pull upwards a fraction when he strides into the bathroom. I didn't throw up this morning, she says. There's an odd sense of pride in it that she doesn't really understand, but Callum seems to, his grin widening as he kneels before her to press a kiss against the bump. It's barely one, if anything, it just looks like Rayla had a big dinner last night, and her clothes cover it up so well that no one else would notice at all, but it's there nonetheless. She's a little afraid of it still, but Callum's excitement and fascination is catching. Their baby is growing, and it's growing happily, a little half-elf, half-human bundle of cells probably about the size of a lemon now, according to Callum's notes, that'll come out in 6 months' time, an actual baby. What a thought. Nice of you to let your mom have a day off from the nausea, he says to it with a smirk. I think she might be pleased. Mum, she says pointedly, eyeing the top of his head, is very pleased. I might even be able to have more than bread for breakfast today. Callum snorts at her, kissing her belly once more before he gets up again to give her one on her lips. You're going to confuse the baby if you insist on calling yourself mum instead of mom. Feel like I'm the one that gets to make that decision, seeing as I am its mum. She smirks back at him, enjoying the pretend pout that graces his lips and the spark of mischief that lights his eyes. I guess, Callum sighs. He rolls his eyes at her, but he doesn't argue the point, at least for now. There's an anxiety that flashes in his eyes, and Rayla understands, they are not quite past the 12-week mark yet, and it's almost like he's afraid to start making jokes about it until he knows for sure that it's safe. She breathes out carefully. We'll go see Rowena again in a few days, she says. It'll be fine. I know, he murmurs, his eyes soft, his smile fond. I'm just overthinking it, perhaps. Rayla chuckles at him. She offers him a reassuring smile and does up his shirt the rest of the way before he has the chance to dwell any more on the thought. Her fingers are brisk, making quick work of it, and there's something strangely domestic about the way he lets her. It just feels simple, she thinks, like they really are just two newlyweds expecting their first baby, instead of a human prince and an elven ambassador caught up in the overly complicated politics of human-elf relations. Her fingers linger at his collar, just for a moment, but she takes his hand when she's done, places it on her belly, the bump, small as it is, firm under his fingers. Bubs there, she murmurs. Not very big, but they're all the same. He smiles, releasing the breath that had hitched itself in his throat, and the tension in his shoulders with it. Sorry, he mutters. This baby. You don't have to explain, Rayla tells him, pressing a kiss to his nose. I get it. She lets him remind himself that everything's fine, that she's fine and that their baby is too, for a moment longer before she squares her shoulders and takes a breath. Let me finish up, she says at last. I think I deserve some breakfast I can enjoy for once. They set up another appointment with Rowena 2 days into Rayla's 12th week. It's still at the Wishbone, the less attention they can draw to themselves, the better, for now at least. There's only so long they can keep this to themselves, and doing so longer than they need to would start a scandal worse than if they just make an official announcement about it. Personally, Rayla thinks it's all a lot unnecessary. This baby should be no one's business but theirs and their immediate families, but Callum's still a prince, and his people have to know. They intend to tell them just before they leave for Xadia again, Rayla thinks. Assuming Rowena gives them the all clear, and that everything's progressing as well as it can be. They'll let Ezran tell the rest of the city at the end of the week and, hopefully, they'll be on their way long before they have to deal with the publicity. It won't be so bad, Rowena tells them. Most of the city's adjusted well to the idea of you, princess. I don't think there's anything to worry about. As much as I'd like to believe that, I somehow doubt they're all so well adjusted, says Rayla dryly. Rowena smirks a little, loosening the tourniquet around Rayla's arm as she draws her blood into a syringe. It's all routine stuff, she'd said, just to make sure that her body's got what it needs for both her and the baby. It's not such a surprise to Rayla, but it's pretty new. As far as antenatal care goes for humans, elves have been drawing blood for medicine for centuries, but Rowena's hands still shake around the syringe. You're staying for a few days longer, aren't you? She asks absently. Rayla nods at her, careful not to move her arm. We'll be here till the end of the week. Is that enough time for those tests? Oh, that's heaps, says Rowena cheerfully. I can make sure you'll have everything you need before you go too. After that, you shouldn't need to see me again until week 20. That's a long time, says Callum, frowning a little. You said once a month would have been ideal. Rowena chuckles. It would be, but it's not exactly realistic, Your Highness, she tells him. As long Her Highness takes it easy and baby's growth is what it should be, week 20 will be fine. If you're really worried, I can show you how to do a couple of things yourself. Callum's eyes light up at that. Can you, please? Of course, she says with an eager nod. If that's okay with you, princess. At least that way you'll know if something's not right, and you can get appropriate care wherever you are. You'll turn him into a nightmare, teases Rayla, but go on. It's probably better than the alternative. Callum makes a face at her, but she only shrugs, her smirk widening. He turns out to be a very good student. He listens intently to Rowena and asks her probably a few too many questions, but he's naturally curious and easily excitable when it comes to anything related to the baby, and the active care of it and its mother this early on is probably something he'd never imagined he'd get to learn. Rowena gives him a bunch of charts and a little booklet full of even more notes and things to watch for, tells him exactly how much weight Rayla should be putting on per week to make sure everything's on track, shows him how to take a fundal height measurement to estimate baby's growth. Altogether, it feels like an excuse to let Callum be even fussier still, but his fascination with it is sweet. Rayla's smile is exasperated by the end of it all, but it's genuine when she concludes that it can only mean he'll be a great dad. They are halfway through a conversation about how the elves at the clinic will use magic to estimate iron and vitamin levels in Rayla's blood when they hear something crash downstairs. Lesser shrieks. Eleni swears. There's a scuffing against the floorboards, and then Claudia's voice sounds from out on the street, firm and angry. Who the hell threw that? Rayla catches Callum's eye. Something's wrong, they can both feel it, and they frown at each other, their conversation forgotten. Stay up here, Callum tells Rowena. You too, he adds to Rayla. She snorts. Yeah. No. Rayla. I'm not having this argument now, Callum. If something's happened, I want to know about it. He skulls, but Rayla pushes past him to prove a point. They head down the staircase together, Rayla first, followed by Callum, Rowena descending halfway, curious and concerned, to find Eleni comforting her sniffling daughter as she bounces her wailing little boy, and a shattered front window, its glass strewn dangerously across the floor. The brick that did it is lying on the floorboards amidst spilled tonics and broken wares. Out of instinct, Rayla reaches for one of her blades. She holds it tight and at the ready, her knuckles white around the hilt, her shoulders tensed and her hackles raised, but Callum tugs her back as Claudia storms back into the shop, furious. What happened? He demands. Claudia scowls at him. Exactly what it looks like, she snaps. Some jerk threw a brick through the front window and took off. Is everything okay? Asks Rowena. She pushes past Callum with a worried frown. Is anyone hurt? We're both fine, says Eleni. To Lesser, she adds, everything's okay, see. Look, even Turin's calming down. We're okay. You wanna go upstairs with Auntie Rowie while we clean this up? Lesser nods wordlessly, her cheeks tear-stained. She steps carefully over the glass without argument and puts her hand in Rowena's. Claudia waits until they are upstairs and out of earshot before she lets out a string of curses so vile that Rayla finds herself marginally impressed. In the end, she picks through the debris to take the broom from the back room. "Why don't you take Turin upstairs?" she says to Eleni. "I think Lesady probably feel better too. We can do this." Eleni looks between them uneasily, but Turin's still blubbering in her arms, and Lesa's probably still upset, and reluctant as she is, she knows her children need her more. She catches the way the Rayla and Callum and Claudia look at each other anyway, the frown on Rayla's face, the seriousness on Callum's, and the scowl on Claudia's, and nods. "Just let me know if you need anything, okay?" "You got it," mutters Callum. He steps out of her way, and when Eleni's upstairs, he turns to Claudia. "I thought the city got past this." "It did," says Claudia. "There are more elves here than ever, and most people are happy that they are." "Most people," grumbles Rayla. Claudia grimaces. "There's always been tension," she says. "Honestly, it's amazing that this is the first time this has happened here. It's just, I think, since the wedding." "Ah." Callum and Rayla fall silent. As much as they want to believe it, Catullus hasn't come that far. Its relationship with Xadia has come in leaps and bounds compared to what it was, but there is absolutely still resistance to Rayla's presence here. It's naive to think that that's where it stops. Their marriage was always going to be a point of discussion, there was always going to be tension and debate and opposition to it, but they'd never considered it escalating to vandalism. It makes her wonder if this has happened in other places in the city. If other elves, or elf-human couples have had trouble too. If it's escalated so much since the wedding that people are openly attacking them. "Maybe we should wait," mutters Callum. "To do what?" "To announce the baby." Claudia shakes her head. "It'll be worse if you don't, and you know it. You guys are prince and princess. There has to be transparency there, they have to feel like they can trust you, especially given you two are married now. Anything that sounds like a scandal will only work against you, and even worse, Ezran. In any case, maybe news of a baby might calm things down. Maybe it'll remind everyone how to get along." "You'd think a wedding would do that too," says Rayla dryly. "But, transparency is right. Anything we actively try to keep secret's just going to blow up in our faces. We just need to handle it, delicately. And carefully," warns Claudia. "This feels like it could get dangerous." "We'll be fine," Claudia says Callum quietly. He breathes a sigh, stepping over the glass and to the broken window. "There's not a lot we can do about whoever did this now. In the meantime, I can fix up the glass, I guess. Maybe put a charm up, make sure it can't happen again." "That's probably a good idea." Claudia lets out a rueful snort. "Aelus is going to kill me." "Not you," mutters Rayla. "Whoever did it, probably, if we ever get hold of them." She pauses, putting her blade back into the sheath at her back. "Has this happened anywhere else?" Claudia pauses, sweeping the glass into a heap, her lips pursed thoughtfully as she considers the question. "Nothing like this, no," she says finally. "There've been, you know, dirty looks and rude comments and stuff, but there's always been that." She huffs, leaning her chin against the end of the broom. "We're probably worry over nothing," she says after a moment. "Most of the city's still fine with it, and I'm not just saying that to be optimistic. Maybe it was just some kids. This was probably just a one-off." Rayla snorts. It's naive, but she certainly hopes so. The announcement is made at the end of the week. Balan's not there for it. He's not foolish enough to be seen so close the castle, not while the prince and princess, he sneers at the title, are still here, and not while the guards on shift have no allegiance to him. He hears about it third hand from the blacksmith on the northern quarter of the city. "A baby so soon," says the smith as he works. "I don't know why I'm so surprised." "Yes, well, His Highness has never had the capacity to keep his hands to himself, particularly not when it came to our new princess. It takes a lot more effort than he thinks he has to keep himself from scowling, but the smith hardly notices." "I don't see the appeal," he says mildly. "There are more of them in the city every day, and there are so many of those half-elf kids that there's an elf-human clinic now. I'm not opposed to it, but I don't get it." "You and me, both," says Balan. He watches the smith pat the sweat off his face with a sooty cloth before he puts his tools down at last and takes the item Balin had commissioned him to make from its place on the wall. He hands it to Balin, half unsheathed. "Not to be vain, but it's some of my best work," he says. "Perfectly balanced, easy to handle. I'm especially proud of the engraving on the hilt. You could fool anyone into thinking a Sunforge elf made that. It's a beautiful dagger, if I do say so myself." "What's it for?" Balin scoffs, twirling it around in his hands, testing its weight and balance before he sheaths it again and pulls a bag of gold from his belt. "It's fine work," he agrees, but he chooses his next words carefully. "It's a gift," he tells the smith. "My daughter's having a baby too. I want her to be able to look after herself if her husband's away." "Ah," says the blacksmith. "Not another half-elf child, I hope?" "Unfortunately," says Balin wryly. "But a grandchild is still a grandchild." "I suppose," mutters the smith. "Thanks for your business." "Thank you," says Balin, tucking the dagger into his belt, something like a smirk tugging at his lips. "I'm sure she'll put it to good use." Notes. "Sorry for the delay, team. I basically live at work now, but also, now that this thing apparently has a plot, I had to rework my original skeleton for it. Feel like it knows what it wants now, should make actually writing it a little easier." Chapter 8. Summary. "You never did know how not to touch her, nephew," she signs to Callum. "I remember that being a problem even before you were engaged." Chapter text. 8. Expecting already? Aunt Amaya signs. "Not in the business of wasting time, are you?" Her lips are quirked upwards, amused and smirking, and while it's obvious that she means to tease her nephew and his now wife about their inability to abstain, Callum's not fooled. She's still not entirely sold on elves in general, but she's come a long way. She only pretends to dislike Rayla now, much in the same way Rhiannon pretends to dislike Callum, but even in spite of that, the spark of excitement in her eye is unmistakable. Ezran had made an announcement about it this morning. They'd hoped to leave Katolis this same afternoon, but Aunt Amaya's return had delayed them. She's been serving as general of the Katolan army for a little more than a year now, but she and Commander Gren had been needed at the breach immediately after the wedding. They'd left the following day, which was a shame, Callum remembers thinking, because they'd barely had the chance to talk at all during the reception. It doesn't feel right to leave now. "We can put it off one more day," Rayla had said, understanding in her smile. "Seems a bit rude to have your aunt hear about it second-hand when we're here now." "Zadia's not going anywhere." He'd kissed her then. One firm and affectionate against her cheek that had her made her giggle in a way that made him doubly grateful to have her. He's glad they'd waited. It's rare that he and his brother and his aunt can have dinner together as a family, and Aunt Amaya's excitement for them is obvious, even to Rayla. Beside her, Commander Gren's grin is so wide, he looks as if he might burst at the seams. "How exciting for the both of you," he says. "You must be thrilled, your highnesses." "Closer to terrified, but you know." Callum lets out a chuckle, his cheeks tinged red under his aunt's knowing stare. We know it's a bit soon and the math doesn't work out right for this to have happened on, our wedding night, but..." "Literally no one cares," interrupts Ezran happily. "You saw the crowd out there today, they're just as excited for you as we are." "Feel like you might be generalizing a bit," says Rayla with a smirk, but it falls a little when Aunt Amaya directs her next question at her. "How far along are you?" She flushes at that. 12, almost 13 weeks, she mutters, her hands signing her answer. Aunt Amaya's own smirk only grows wider. "You never did know how not to touch her, nephew," she signs to Callum. "I remember that being a problem even before you were engaged." Callum goes redder still, but it's true. A year ago, when Ezran had first presented them with the idea of being married, he'd panicked so fast and so hard that his denial of the depth of their relationship had nearly ruined them, and still, he found excuses to touch her hands and her face and her hair at every opportunity, so much so that she'd left, thinking his affection for her was limited to their friendship even when it was obvious to everyone but him how in love with her he had been. Now, the idea of not being married to her at all is ridiculous to him, and as much trouble as it gave her, as much of a mess as it had been, it was worth it, in the end, because if Ez hadn't done it, if he hadn't forced Callum to look at their relationship right in its face, he might still not have realized how much he loved her to begin with. This is better. In every way. And in spite of the way his aunt teases them, he takes Rayla's hands in his and presses it to his lips. Still don't, he says, stupid grin on his face. Not really a problem now, though. So gross, snorts Ezran, but he's all smiles nonetheless. So, do you think it'll be a boy or a girl? Have you thought of names yet? Are you gonna have the baby here or at home? Rayla hesitates, her cheeks paling just a little. One thing at a time, hey, she manages weakly. We've only just got around to telling everyone. We haven't even really talked about that far ahead. Ez presses his lips together, like there are a million more questions on his mind, but he holds them in his throat and swallows them in an effort not to overwhelm her. He's probably been the most overt about his excitement though. Callum's already heard him muttering to Bate about gifts for his impending niece or nephew, but he doesn't ask any more questions. Instead, he grins at them both, and says, whatever you guys decide, there's always room for you and the baby here. I mean, I know it's not Xadia, and I don't want to be presumptuous at all, but the castle can be your home just as much as it is Callum's if you want it to be. That makes Rayla smile a little. That's sweet, as she says. Don't you worry though. Even if the little moonbeam isn't born here, you'll see plenty of it. Us too, I hope, signs Amaya. Halfling or not, that's still my grandniece or nephew. I'd better not be deprived of the opportunity to spoil it. Of course not, Aunt Amaya, laughs Callum. We wouldn't even dream of it. Their first meeting together as married ambassadors is a negotiation about opening Xadian ports in the south to trading vessels from the Pentarchy. It's not for a week or so yet, but it'll be an easy trip, one they've made before, and, now that Rayla's not sick every morning, one they can make in good time even if they delay leaving for another day. The break's been nice, not so secretly. Callum hopes they might have time for another one soon, but reality is calling, and things have already started to creep back into place. Rayla's growing restless and bored of the congratulations and the probing questions about details they haven't even talked about yet, and she's all but itching to leave the following morning. She's well and truly tired of the weeks she's spent feeling too nauseous to move. She wants to get back to work, and she wants to be active again, or as active as Rowena says she's allowed to be, in any case. Ultimately, things have gone back to normal, except for the fact that they are married now, and the fact that the whole continent might know about the baby in a couple of days' time, of course, but they are as prepared as they can be for the changes those might bring. What they are not prepared for is the onslaught of gifts that arrive the morning after EZ's announcement. It starts off innocently enough, a pair of knitted baby booties from Claudia and Soren that they'd apparently made themselves, no dark magic, the card reads proudly, a little book of traditional human and elf fables from the staff at Rowena's clinic, a wrap with a ring fastener like the one they'd seen Eleni carrying baby Turin around in from Aelus and his family, little things that aren't entirely necessary but Callum and Rayla appreciate all the same. The more outrageous gifts come while they are trying to get their things together to leave. This is a human tradition, then, says Rayla, unamused as a pair of guards lug a crib from one of the lesser families into their room. It's the second one, more extravagant than any crib should have the right to be, its exquisite silver frame glinting brightly in the sunlight. There's already a pile of stuff in the first one, multiple sets of baby clothes, probably 6 rattles, more dummies than 3 babies could probably go through, stuff that they honestly have no need for and are more capable of getting themselves if there's ever a moment that they do. As if elves don't get expecting couples nice things, snorts Callum. Oh, they do, drawls Rayla. But not to this extent. Callum rolls his eyes at her, picking through the things in the first crib with a grimace. They mean well, he says patiently. But yeah, you're right. This is excessive. It's not all bad, though, right? Some of this stuff might come in handy. Well, yeah, we just have too much of it. Rayla huffs, flipping through the book Rowena's clinic had sent with an absent little smile. We could always donate a bunch of it. Turin'll probably need some of this stuff, and there have gotta be other families that'll put this stuff to better use than us. That's a sweet idea, says Callum, grinning brightly at her. A truly princessly suggestion, if I do say so myself. Rayla skulls and tosses the nearest cushion at him. I mean it, laughs Callum, dodging out of its path with practiced ease. It's a good idea. I think we should do it, although, it might have to wait till we come back. If we go through all this stuff now, we'll never be able to leave. How unfortunate, snorts Rayla. She shakes her head at the pile in the first crib. The things from their friends and family, they keep in a separate, much smaller pile, one that might actually fit all together in Callum's pack. She eyes the wrap fondly. It's soft and light and useful, particularly for two ambassadors always on the road. The material dark and embroidered in silver with traditional moon shadow patterns. It's probably something Alis had gotten on his latest trip into Zadia, but most of all, it's practical. It's one of the few things they'd received today that she and Callum both actually like, and she hopes, when they get back, that they remember to thank them appropriately for it. Come on, then, she says finally, gathering it into a heap with Claudia and Soren's hand-knitted booties and the little book of fables. Let's get a move on. Callum holds his pack open for her, and they are partway through packing it all in neatly when a guard knocks against their bedroom door. Your Highnesses, they hear him say. You've received another one. Rayla almost groans. That's it, she mutters under her breath. We're never leaving. We're trapped here forever. Callum stifles a snort, but he gets up to open the door for the guard anyway. Tell me this is the last one. The guard bows deeply. The last one so far, Your Highness, he says, his own amusement obvious even in his professionalism. He hands them a sheathed dagger and a little roll of parchment. From Duran, this time, my prince. Callum raises an eyebrow at him. Duran, he asks, frowning a little. Rayla frowns too, giving up on packing to examine the note over Callum's shoulder. The seal is immediately familiar, a single upturned flower on blue wax, Queen Anya's. Callum hands it to her and, curious, Rayla breaks it with her thumb and squints at the spindly handwriting. Your Royal Highnesses, Prince Callum and Princess Rayla shudders. Rayla. Congratulations to you both. I'd hoped to tell you in person, but it might be months before you'll be in Duran, so please accept this gift instead, a little something from me to the coming baby who I know will be as brave as his or her father and as much of a warrior as his or her mother. All the best, Anya. That's nice of her, says Callum, unsheathing the dagger curiously. He's still frowning at it, thoughtful, and like there's something about it that he's missing, but Rayla takes it out of his hands and flips it gracefully in hers. It's a good dagger, she says, impressed. She must have had it made especially. There are a ton of Sunfire elves in Duran, it can't have been hard to find a smith who'd do it. A dagger, though, asks Callum, dubious. Rayla gives him a pointed look. I got my first weapon when I was 3, she says dryly. Plenty of elves do. It's not that weird. Besides, it teaches responsibility. I guess, mumbles Callum, still unsure. But still. A dagger. For a baby that hasn't even been born yet. Still not that weird, snorts Rayla, but she sheaths it again and hands it back to him. Why don't you hold on to it for the time being? You don't own one, and it'd be nice if you could learn to use weapons that aren't mine. I thought you didn't mind sharing. Not the point. Rayla smirks at him, holding the dagger out with the handle towards him. Seriously? You hold it. You can give it to Bub when he or she's old enough and you think they're ready. Okay. Callum hesitates, but in the end, he shakes his head and rolls his eyes, taking the dagger from Rayla with an exasperated sigh. There, he says, tucking it into his belt. Happy? Very, says Rayla with a grin. Now, let's go before anything else turns up. He laughs at that. They ride out of the city gates in the early afternoon. It happens regularly enough that the crowds don't gather to wish them farewell anymore, but the market is still packed enough for Balan to watch, unnoticed, as the prince and his elven whore of a princess joke quietly to each other on their way out of the city. You delivered it then, he asks quietly. He's standing at a stall, pretending to look over the wares of a traveling glassmaker from the south. His informant is a castle guard, out of his armor and invisible even to the others posted at the gates. He's one of the few in the castle still loyal to Balan, one whose allegiance hadn't been immediately discovered by Ezran and his crown guard and thus hadn't been immediately dismissed for it. As requested, the guard murmurs. The prince has it now. The elf was supposed to take it. She did, says the guard. And she gave it to him. Or so I was told. Balan snarls, turning just slightly to look at him from the corner of his eye. Those weren't my instructions. What does it matter, asks the guard irritably. He'll never be without her. Your plan works either way. Balin scowls at him, but he turns once more and the prince and his princess are gone. They are outside the city now, on their way to whatever meeting requires their attention next, and all that's left to do is wait until their return before the next stage of his plan is put into gear. There's a lot riding on this, and if, at any point, the prince notices the rune inscribed with dark magic inside the sheath of the dagger, he might as well just walk himself to the gallows. Him and what's left of the network of spies he has within the castle. He huffs. You'd better hope it does, he mutters darkly, or it's your head as much as it is mine. Chapter 9. Summary. He's my husband, corrects Rayla sharply, and if he needs an invitation, then so do I. Chapter text. 9. Alon is a port city nestled within a little bay on the southwest coast of Xadia. It's an old place, filled with wind-battered stone buildings and ancient ocean magic, but it's never been one of Rayla's favorite places. It's an important town for sea travel and trade, but centuries of war haven't been kind to the elves here. In her memory, they are uptight and hard to negotiate with, and the watching and the waiting and the sinking of any and all human vessels that sail past have tempered them in the worst way imaginable for the brokering of peace. Its position on the far side of southern ranges keeps it isolated from the rest of Xadia too, but all things considered, the trip's not so bad. The journey reminds her of the old days. The nights were colder, back then, when they made camp out in the open, when the muscles in their legs were perpetually sore, when the only real pressing issue was surviving long enough to bring ZYM home. They stay in inns and travel on horseback now, but in a way, Rayla sort of misses the simplicity of it. Her and Callum and ZYM, camping and catching rabbits and cooking on an open fire, they were hard days, but they were good days, and they were just kids, who didn't have to consider the political repercussions of their every action. Things are different now, and it's something she keeps firmly in mind as Callum helps her off Voro Bay while a council representative, an Ocean Mage's apprentice, she thinks, judging by the seafoam of his cloak, looks between them obviously displeased. They're at the city gates. The two guards on either side of the representative are wordless as they take Voro Bay and Kuritsa by the reins to lead them inside, but the representative studies them, his frown one wrinkle away from being a sneer, before he bows and follows suit. Welcome to Alon, your highnesses, he says stiffly, leading them through the gates. The city offers its congratulations to you both, for your recent nuptials, and for your coming child. The council has been, looking forward to your meeting. There's something about the way he says it that makes Rayla think that they absolutely have not been looking forward to it at all. She takes a breath. Thank you for meeting us, she says diplomatically. We're very grateful to have been invited back into your city in the first place. You require no invitation, the representative says to Rayla quietly. He glances at Callum with a scowl, the great city gates closing shut behind them. You're human, on the other hand. He's my husband, corrects Rayla sharply, and if he needs an invitation, then so do I. The representative pauses. His eyes flit to Callum, distrustful and uneasy, but he ducks his head. My apologies, princess, he sneers, his youth betrayed by his informality. He says nothing else until they come to a stop outside an inn overlooking the port. He opens the door, nods to the innkeeper on his way past, and leads Callum and Rayla up a narrow stone staircase to a room on the second floor. Your room, he says with obvious dislike. I hope this will suffice. Our sincerest apologies for the lack of extravagance. This is fine, says Callum at last. His tone is patient, but his hand slips into hers to calm her as she feels her hackles rise. Thank you for going to so much trouble. Has anything changed regarding our meeting with the council? No, your highness, says the representative. You're still to meet them tomorrow before noon. I'll come and collect you then. May I offer you anything else? No, says Callum, before she can. Thank you again for your hospitality. Very good, says the representative. He shuts their door without bowing, and Rayla sculls, collapsing into a heap in the armchair by the window. Callum raises an eyebrow at her, his smile amused. He wasn't that bad, he says, pulling the footstool over to sit in front of her. He's just young. Ezran, and Anya, and Rowena are young too, snaps Rayla. What's his excuse? He grew up here, offers Callum. He heaves her feet into his lap and tugs her boots off with gentle hands. That's what we're here for, remember. To show them how to get along. I guess, she grumbles, shifting uncomfortably in her chair and unclasping her belt and her vest. She sighs as shrugs out of them, relishing how much easier it is to breathe. She's 14, almost 15, weeks along now, and the swell in her belly's not so inconspicuous anymore. She can hide it still, but it's growing more uncomfortable by the day. Her vest only has so much give, and it can't be good for the baby if she keeps wearing it longer than she needs to. Callum grins at her. How's our little moonbeam doing? Despite herself, Rayla chuckles at the name. Well enough, she says, hand rubbing the bump gently. I think she purses her lips. I think I felt it move today. What? Callum's eyes go wide, his lips parting in an excited gasp. Really? Rayla pauses, looking down at her abdomen with a thoughtful smile. I think so. It's hard to say, but your notes said it might feel like butterflies, and her smile widens as something flutters within her belly, too confident and too consistent to be anything else. She beckons him closer. You might not be able to feel it just yet, but it's moving now. Callum scoots forward eagerly, his hands gentle as he places them against the bump. Rayla almost laughs at him, his happy smile, and his shining eyes, and the weird sort of tickle in her belly doesn't help. It's insistent, as if it wants her to be sure that it's there and it's growing, but its movements are still too little for Callum to feel them too. He pouts, pressing his ear against the bump like it'll help, but he comes away after a moment with a disappointed sigh. Soon, Bobby, he says. You keep talking to your mom, though, that way we know you're okay. Of course it's okay, says Rayla, smiling fondly at him. We'll have to start thinking about names soon. Soon, snorts Callum. I have names picked out now. You would? She does laugh at him this time, because he's so eager and so earnest and so excited that he can barely even contain it. The baby's been the only thing that's on his mind for weeks, and it shows in the way he dotes over her, even when he thinks he's holding back. She presses a kiss into his hair, a little hesitant around names even though she was the one who'd suggested it, because there's a while to go yet and anything could happen in that time. You don't even know if it's a boy or a girl, she says instead, a halfway response, one that doesn't discourage him but doesn't egg him on just yet, either. I have names that I like for both, he says, but he catches the hesitation in her eyes anyway and eases back. What do you think it'll be? Rayla blinks at him. I dunno, I haven't thought about it. You've been carrying it around for almost 15 weeks now. Your guess will probably be better than mine. She pauses, her lips pursed together, her eyes thoughtful when they land on her belly. A little girl, she murmurs at last. When she catches Callum's eye again, he's grinning wider than ever. I could be wrong, she adds hastily. There's no way to be sure. It sounds nice though, right, he says, kissing her fingers. She'll have 8 fingers and your eyes, and she'll be just as stubborn and just as pretty as her mom. Gods, Rayla, it's been weeks and I still can't get over the fact that we're having a baby. It is pretty exciting, huh? She hums, trying to imagine it, a tiny little girl with bright violet eyes and her father's mop of brown hair, learning magic with him and how to fight with her. In truth, it still scares her. There's a part of her that really, genuinely believes that she's not fit to be a mother, but Callum's trust in her is comforting, and the longer this child exists, the more she wants to trust in herself too. You really think I can do this, she murmurs. Be a mother, I mean. I know you can, says Callum, tucking her hair behind her ears. All you have to do is love it. Everything else comes from that. She hums once more, a sort of tentative belief in it, her fingers drumming gentle beats into her belly as the child within it shifts and flutters. Callum watches her for a while with a quiet joy in his eyes. They are so far from home, so far from any sort of comfort or security, from his brother, and his aunt, and his friends, but he's with his wife, and his baby is growing pretty determinedly in her womb, and Rayla knows from the look on his face that that's all that matters to him. He really is happy like this, with her, and he loves her and this baby so much that he doesn't even know how to express it. In the end, she smiles, pulling her legs off his lap and tugging him upwards so she can help him out of his belt and jacket. It's late, she says quietly, leaving his things in a pile at his feet. It's been a long day and it'll be even longer tomorrow. Maybe we should get some rest. Maybe we should, he says, pulling her close. Or we could do something else. Rayla laughs. Something else then, she says, pressing a kiss onto his lips. She leaves the dagger lying heavily on the floor. Their meeting is dull and frustrating. Twice, Rayla has to interrupt Counselor Eldoris in his spiels about how humans are lowly and savage to let Callum even get a word in, reminding herself often that diplomacy is key in making progress, and threatening the old elf now would do exactly the opposite. I'm not understanding your reluctance, Callum says, his voice far calmer than Rayla could ever manage 2 hours into a negotiation about opening a port. We're not at war anymore, and there's nothing to lose and everything to gain. We have nothing to gain from humans, says Eldoris stiffly. Anything you have to offer, we have no need for. We offer friendship. An alliance, if you ever need it. Cheaper solutions to problems than even primal magic can't solve. We will not open our ports to dark magic. No one said anything about dark magic. Callum takes a breath, his patience obviously wearing thin. Trade is an essential part of peace, he begins again. Opening your ports to human vessels would cut the travel time for merchants traveling by sea in half. There are elves living in Katolis now who could use it, at least consider them. Katolis, snorts Eldoris. Perhaps you should ease the tension in your own city before you come to tell me how to govern mine. Callum and Rayla stare at him, and Eldoris smirks at the way confusion crosses their faces. You haven't heard, he sneers. Been too caught up in each other and in the extravagance of palace life, have you? Are you too royal now, princess, that you haven't noticed your own people struggling to live in the city you claim to serve? What in the name of the bloody moon are you talking about, snaps Rayla, her patience gone in one blow. The elves in Katolis are thriving, they have been since after we got engaged. There are healers there now, and general stores, and blacksmiths, and more elf-human unions than we can even count. Eldoris scoffs, his smirk widening. We've received reports that the human residents of Katolis aren't happy with the number of elves your king is letting into the city. To them, elves are still bloodthirsty monsters who want nothing more than to overrun their home. There'll be riots next. You know how you show them elves aren't bloodthirsty monsters. Rayla snarls. You open your ports to human vessels. And allow that same animosity into Elon. I think we'll pass. He gets up, collecting his various texts and scrolls in his arms, and jerks his head at the rest of his council to follow suit. This meeting is done for the day, your highnesses. Good day to you both. They leave through the double doors in the back of the room without another word, leaving Callum and Rayla sitting stunned and alone in the Elon City Council chambers. When sense hits her again, she reaches into her pocket for the message mirror within it, activates it with a deft swipe of her thumb, and writes into it for Claudia. Is everything okay over there? What'd he mean riots, muses Callum out loud while they wait for a response. If there was that much hostility in the city, you'd think we would have noticed. You'd think so, grumbles Rayla, drumming anxious rhythms against the table with her fingers. I mean, someone did throw a brick through Ayla's shop window. That's not the same. There has to be more than just that sort of tension for people to think there might riots next. How would he even know? This city's been closed off from literally everyone else, what would Eldoris know that we don't? The message mirror lights up again before Callum has the chance to answer. Rayla practically scrambles for it, her fingers digging into its edges as her writing wipes clean and is replaced with Claudia's much neater, loopier hand. Everything's fine. Why? Rayla pauses. She glances at Callum, wondering how she should respond, but Callum looks uneasily between her and the double doors the council had disappeared through, the thoughts running through his head plain as day on his face. What would Eldoris know? He's never been to Katolis. He's never even left Elon. It's rich of him to assume that EZ's governance of Katolis is wrong when his own governance is closing off the entirety of the world. And if there was something wrong, they would have noticed. Claudia or Soren would have noticed. Someone would have told Ez, and, whatever it was, this would already be sorted. It's probably nothing, he says at last. Just Eldoris trying to get under our skin. Rayla lets out a sigh, her hand flitting to her belly. Yeah, she mutters quietly. That's probably all it is. She hopes. Chapter 10. Summary. You can't just name a kid after the draconic word for your favorite primal source, she says, exasperated. Do you even know how ridiculous that sounds? You might as well name the child Moon. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. X. The tavern is loud tonight. The buzz and the noise of it fills Balan's ears like flies, and the smell of pipe smoke irritates his nose, but he sits in his corner booth anyway, drinking deeply out of his tankard and enjoying the growing discomfort. There's been tension since the wedding, but it's coming to a head. Balan can feel it in the air, and in his bones, like static before a storm. What did Ezran think would happen? Opening the gates of Katolis to Xadia with little regard as to how many of those monsters come in or out. What about his own people, and their homes and safety? Their jobs and their security and their privacy? There are smiths losing business to Sunfire elves, and doctors losing their practices to Xadian healers. The streets are overcrowded, and, come winter, the city's agricultural stores will barely be able to provide. Ezran is a human king before he's anything else, but it feels as if he and his brother have forgotten that in favor of their show of peace, and the common folk are noticing. It was only ever going to lead to this. There's too many of them, snaps a man by the bar. There's more of their spawn in the streets every day. The city can't keep up with this. What do you expect His Majesty to do, scowls a woman. Kick them out. All at once. Start another war. There'll be war within his own city if he's not careful. He doesn't hear the rest. Someone slides into the seat in front of him, his own tankard, heavy with mead, in hand, the same guard who'd delivered the dagger to the prince and his elf. Sowing dissent among the common folk, are you? This wasn't my doing, snorts Balan. Ezran guaranteed this when he married his brother off to that whore, foolish child that he is. It would have happened eventually, even if we weren't here to move things along. And the prince won't be back for a while yet, he says mildly. He and his elf only left alone this morning. They have other meetings to attend to first. I imagine they won't be back until Her Highness needs to see her midwife again. My sources say that won't be for weeks, hisses the guard. What, exactly, do you expect to be doing until then? Why, this. Balan gestures at the rest of the tavern, amused by the way the unease in the bar is almost palpable. He eyes the guard with a smirk, understanding of his impatience. Conspiring against the crown is a dangerous pastime, and the longer they do so without action only makes it more dangerous still. He takes a drink from his tankard, waving him off with confidence in his machinations and their likelihood of success. He's had the better part of a year to plan this, after all, and it's rather convenient that things keep going his way. Don't look so concerned, he says at last. I've made all the arrangements. All you have to do is allow entrance to the castle once the prince and the elf return to the city. There will be nothing to implicate you, you can rest assured in that. And, the guard swallows. If this fails. It won't fail, says Balan smugly. I can almost guarantee it. X. This is the third time they've tried to talk the Council of Elon into opening its ports for human vessels, and, if Callum were being totally honest, it's not such a huge surprise that it's the third time they've failed. They give up halfway through Rayla's 15th week, at least they'd tried, Callum thinks, which is an altogether better approach to this third failure than, well, considering it a failure to begin with, but they pack their things together without complaint the morning they intend to leave, relieved that they no longer have to put up with the blatant bigotry of Eldoris and his council. It's been a frustrating week. Eldoris seems convinced that Katolis is a pot, simmering slowly but surely to a violent boil, but Claudia's messages assure them that things are fine. Between her and a stuffy old elf who's never even left his city, Callum thinks it's relatively reasonable to place his trust in her word over his, but it gnaws at him anyway. Part of him wants to forego their next meeting entirely, to get back to the city and to see for themselves that things are well and truly okay, but they have responsibilities to the rest of the Pentarchy and to Xadia that come first. They would have noticed, he keeps telling himself. Ez would know if something was wrong. He would have called them back. Sent them a crow. Had Claudia send a message to Rayla on her mirror. They would know, but it's all he can do to keep himself from worrying about it. He tries to distract himself from it with names. There are a few that he likes already, but he doesn't suggest those right away. Rayla's are still a little nervous, and rightfully so. Childbirth is dangerous even in the best of circumstances, and he doesn't want to overwhelm her. Instead, he picks the ones he knows are terrible, if only because he knows it'll distract her too and ease the tension that's been setting into her shoulders. She's been just as worried as him, even if she won't admit it out loud. His friends and family are hers now as well, and he's seen her checking her message mirror frequently for updates from Claudia, anxious for news and afraid of receiving it at the same time. It's a stressful few weeks. X. Oberon if it's a boy, Titania if it's a girl. They're riding into the mountain town of Avani, on the inland side of the southern ranges. Rayla's 16 weeks along now, and she huddles under his cloak as they ride past the snow-covered entrances to mines and quarries. She's never been one to get cold, but her hormones are all over the place and, stubborn as she is, the swell in her belly is a constant reminder of the fact that she can't continue to be so. She's big enough now that she can't wear her vest anyway, and at least his cloak can hide the fact that she can no longer fit into her armor. They are relatively easy to recognize nowadays, and no bandits would be stupid enough to attack them, but the longer they can fool people into thinking she's still dangerous, the safer it is for them to keep traveling like this. She frowns at him, her lips pressed together in an unimpressed line. Is this a serious suggestion, or are you just being silly? It can be a serious suggestion, says Callum, grinning. I kinda like the name Titania. We can call her Tanya for short. No. She looks almost disgusted by the idea. Those are fairy names. You don't name your kid after fairies. That's just asking for trouble. Callum raises an amused eyebrow at her. I didn't know you were so superstitious. I'm not, scowls Rayla. You just don't name your kids after fairies unless you want them mischievous wee monsters who never go to bed on time and go crazy over sugar. This feels a little personal. We're not naming this child Titania or Oberon, grumbles Rayla. And if you keep suggesting fairy names, you're going to be banned from ever suggesting names again. You don't mean that. I do. You don't. Callum laughs at her as they pull their horses to a halt outside a snowy inn. They've made good time. The sun is low in the sky now, and they can set off again in the morning for the elven city of Adamina for more talks about humans and magic. Callum climbs off Kuritsa carefully, the dagger on his belt hitching against the saddle on his way down, before he holds his hands out to Rayla to help her off Borobe. They're not bad names, he says as she takes them. She sighs. It's a moonshadow elf thing, she mutters. Fairy names are bad luck for parents. Do you seriously want to name this child something like Oberon anyway? No, chuckles Callum. I suppose not. But she hasn't touched the message mirror and her shoulders are considerably less stiff. He calls that a mission accomplished. X. Evind if it's a boy, Araceli if it's a girl. They're in an inn in Adamina. Rayla's scowling at the way her pants won't do up anymore over her now pretty sizable bump. There's a dress in Callum's pack that would fit, something else from Claudia and Soren, but she's been avoiding it. She's never liked dresses, she's only ever worn them for formal occasions, and the idea of traveling in a dress irks her to no end, although, at 17 weeks, he thinks she doesn't really have a choice anymore. Everything's going as well as it can be as far as they can tell. Rowena's notes have been predictive of everything, and their little moonbeam is active enough that Rayla will pause in mid-sentence sometimes just to smile at the way it shifts within her. Its movements still aren't big enough for him to feel, and, secretly, Callum's a little envious that Rayla can feel its presence and he can't, but all the signs are good, so it can only mean he's not far off from getting to feel them too. Pretty sure you just made those up. I did not, says Callum, hoping he doesn't look too amused by her frustration. Those are real names. They're awful. You didn't even think about them. I don't have to, grumbles Rayla. They're awful. I'd bet you can't even spell Evind without looking it up first, and if you can't spell it, how do you expect the kid to? Callum snorts at her. They are supposed to be in a meeting 20 minutes from now, but Rayla's still determined to not wear that maternity dress, and they won't be going anywhere until she finally realizes that it's her only option. He fiddles absently with the dagger, balances it daintily on his finger and watches it rock precariously from side to side. Evind's a nice name. It's really not, says Rayla. And neither is Araceli. Do not saddle your child with names like that, you're not allowed. She scowls once more, throwing her hands in the air in defeat as she tugs her pants back off and looks into his pack for the dress. She pulls it over her head unhappily, her frown closer to a pout than anything else. Callum swallows a snicker, not because it doesn't suit her, it suits her quite nicely, actually, but because the roundness of her belly and the way her dress falls around it turns her Adamas into something cute. He puts the dagger away, little smile on his lips, and gets up, helps her pull her hair out of the neckline and adjusts the tie at her back until it sits better over the bump. No to Evind, she snaps, grimacing at herself in the mirror on the other side of the room. Over my dead body to Araceli. Callum's lips twitch, amused, but he presses them to her temple in an effort to hide his smile. You look nice, by the way, he adds. Pretty. Pretty's not exactly what I'm going for, mutters Rayla, straightening her skirt with a huff. Don't you worry, laughs Callum. Pretty or not, you still look dangerous to me. X. Lunas if it's a boy, Scylla if it's a girl. They are passing through the border town of Fimita. The elves here know them well enough, it's a frequent stop whenever they are passing by Kira and coming from the west or the south. Rayla's pregnancy might as well be common knowledge now, and at 18 weeks along, it's difficult to hide. At least Fimita's a nice town, one they visit enough that people are used to Callum's presence and where the townsfolk don't stare, confused by their affection for each other. There's been no other talk of trouble in Catullus and Callum thinks that that's probably a good sign. No crows have arrived, and no messages from Claudia bearing bad news have appeared in Rayla's mirror. She still checks it frequently, but the tension in her shoulders is all but gone, and she jokes back now when he suggests names. You can't just name a kid after the draconic word for your favorite primal source, she says, exasperated. Do you even know how ridiculous that sounds? You might as well name the child Moon. I guess, says Callum with a shrug. The dagger bumps against his leg as they ride. But have you considered the fact that Scylla sounds like both of our names put together? That's worse. Calla, then, like the lily. No. Raylam. She flicks his shoulder, playful scowl on her lips. Now you're just being dumb. Don't pretend you're not used to it. Callum grins stupidly at her, but she rolls her eyes at him, ended by his efforts to entertain. Calla's not that bad. It's too close to yours, says Rayla. People think you named the kid after yourself. And is that such a bad thing? She snorts unbecomingly at that. No one likes a cocky prince, husband of mine. Callum smirks at her. You do. Stop. X. Amaya if it's a girl, Ranan if it's a boy. It's not such a joke this time. Callum personally doesn't think she'll agree, but they are not names that suck for once, and, at 19 weeks along, he figures he should stop fooling around with dumb names and start coming up with serious ones. It's still pretty early and they should, technically, head back to Catullus soon to see Rowena, but Callum's been taking note of Rayla's fundal measurements and weight gain and sending them to her via Rayla and Claudia's message mirror. She seems happy enough with how things are going, happy enough, even, that she suggests they take their time on the way back. It gives them time to stop for more than a day in Kira, which Callum imagines might give Rayla some time to relax, and Ranan and Tinker, mostly Tinker, a chance to dote over their unborn grandniece or nephew. Moon above, snorts Rayla, can you even imagine? Callum raises an eyebrow at her. What's wrong with naming the baby after my aunt or your uncle? They'd be so conflicted, she laughs. Can you imagine how Ranan might react if we named his half-human grandnephew after him? He'd be so thrilled and so mortified at the same time. He doesn't dislike humans that much. He doesn't like them that much either, teases Rayla. Are you seriously trying to tell me that your Aunt Amaya wouldn't be the same if we named her half-elf grandniece after her? Callum pauses and tries to picture it in his mind. On the one hand, his aunt would be honored, and flattered, and probably a lot smug about it, but on the other hand, she's still not wholly adjusted to the idea of elves, either. She'd love the child anyway, Callum's sure of it, but he thinks Rayla might be right, she'd be mortified too. The idea makes him laugh a little. I notice you didn't say no, he says after a minute, a grin tugging at his lips. Rayla rolls her eyes at him. They're not terrible names, she says. So, we might have names for our baby, then. That's not what I said. Her smile is little, somewhere between amused and playfully impatient, even as she elbows him gently in his ribs, her arm brushing against the edge of the dagger at his hip. But, maybe. Don't know that either is entirely appropriate, but, maybe. X. At the tail end of her 19th week, while they are staying in Kira with her uncles, Callum wakes in the middle of the night to Rayla, shaking his shoulder insistently as she sits on her knees on the bed. He squints at her, dazed and groggy, unsure what she needs. Her eyes are bright in the pale moonlight, and there's a sort of uncertainty on her face, but she says nothing, holds a finger to her lips, and presses his hand to her belly. His heart skips a beat, afraid, for a moment, that something might be wrong, but she holds her hands over his, her breath caught in her throat until something shifts against his palm. Callum feels his throat go dry. He stares at her, his eyes wide and his lips parted, and then a something like a wince crosses her features and he feels the something shift again. Is that? Yeah, she whispers. It's not uncertainty, he realizes. It's disbelief, like she's only just grasped the wholeness of the fact that she's growing their baby. Sure, she adds sharply, when he opens his mouth to let out the excited yelp building in his throat. You'll wake Ranan and Tinker. Just, let it say hi to you first. Callum snaps his jaw shut, his lips tilting upwards into a smile so wide, his face hurts. The baby shifts once more under his palm and he almost loses his mind right there. He tempers himself though, reminds himself that it's the middle of the night, and Rayla's uncles probably won't be pleased with him if he wakes them now with the incoherent babble threatening to escape him. He swallows, instead, tries to breathe through his excitement and to slow the quick staccato of his heart, and puts a delighted kiss against her lips. Hey there, little moonbeam, he whispers. You doing okay in there? It's doing great, I think, says Rayla with a smile. Feels like it's having a party. Callum chuckles, sliding off the bed entirely to press his lips against the bump. You're not even here yet and you're already waking us up in the middle of the night, he jokes. We're so excited to meet you, little one, your mom and I both. Mum teases Rayla. And, speaking of, she hesitates, almost like she's concerned she might be overstepping, but she takes a breath and runs her fingers through his hair. Sorry, she murmurs at last. If it's a girl. Callum's heart swells. He hadn't wanted to suggest it, it didn't feel right, coming from him, but the sound of his mother's name coming from Rayla's lips is so right that, for a moment, he forgets how to speak. Sorry, he agrees finally, clearing the lump in his throat with a cough. If it's a girl. Rayla, He pauses, his eye catching something lighting up against the nightstand between Rayla's blades and the dagger from Anya. It takes him a second, but it's Rayla's mirror, he realizes, and he tears his hands away from her belly to reach for it. His face falls when he sees it, the excitement of feeling his child kick for the first time gone in an instant as Claudia's fine handwriting appears across the glass. Callum. Rayla shakes his shoulder again, her brow furrowed over her eyes. What's wrong? Wordless, he holds the mirror out to her, and Rayla takes it, his fingers leaving moistened prints against its surface. Her face hardens. The clinic Rowena works at caught fire, it reads. There are elves and humans blaming each other for it. You guys have to come back. Something's gone wrong. Notes. You guys, probably, hold the fucking phone, Jelly, isn't this just a 5 things fic crammed into pregnancy fic? Me, you bet your butts it is. Also you guys, probably, also Google says you can't feel the baby move from the outside until, like, 21 weeks. Me, I know, but it's also a half elf, half human baby, so just, okay. Chapter 11. Summary. Mess isn't the word I would use. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. 11. That elf-human clinic burns down in the night. No one's in it when it does, and it's an act of vandalism more than it is anything else, but it riles up the city so much that Balan wishes he'd taken part in it. He'd only put the idea out there, into the heads of 2 foolish teenagers who'd thought they'd understood the complexity of politics and civil unrest without fully grasping the true depth of it. They didn't know any better, they were cocky, impressionable boys who wanted to be involved and didn't stop to consider the consequences of their actions, exactly the idiots he'd needed to pull off an act of such violence. He wonders if they've been caught yet. They won't be hard to find, they are young and stupid and hardly discreet, but ultimately, it doesn't matter to him. The job is done. The city is tense. And the little blip on his map is moving quickly, quicker than it has before, out of the elven town of Kira and back towards the border, probably on the word of that midge girl who used to live in the castle. It's just a tracking rune. Something small he'd drawn in the inside of the sheath of that dagger, something so minute, not even the prince would notice it. It was one of the first things he'd learned how to do out of an old dark magic spellbook he'd picked up in the black markets in Neolandia, and he's pleased, even now, especially now, to know it's still working. He hopes they're nervous. Hopes the messages he's been sending to Elon under the guise of an elven spy have reached them, and that they are even more on edge. He wants them tense, and uncomfortable. He wants them panicked so that their decisions are hasty and poorly thought through. He wants them in the worst possible frame of mind to give his plan the best opportunity to succeed. Just a week or so more now, thinks Balin, smirking as he watches the blip stops for the night in a little village on the Zadian side of the border. He's waited long enough for this. He's going to enjoy watching them crumble. X. The ride home is hurried. The border is only a couple of days from Kira on horseback, but it feels like a week before they cross it. They can only move so fast, riding too quickly isn't so good for the baby, and guilty that she's slowing them down, Rayla suggests twice that Callum go on ahead and that she'll meet him in the city in a few days. He refuses, obviously. Rayla doesn't know why she's so surprised, of course he'd be unwilling to leave her alone, 20 weeks pregnant, on the human side of the border with no company but Vorobei, whom she can't even ride at faster than a brisk walk. As much as she likes to pretend that she can still hold her own, the truth is that the further along in this pregnancy she gets, the more helpless she is. They swap horses again as they pass by that little village at the base of the Moon Nexus, Rayla cursing quietly to herself about the Council of Elon refusing to open their port, even despite her hatred of water. This journey would be so much faster by ship, and they'd be there already if those elves had just put their heads on straight, but the fact that Eldoris had been right is more concerning to her. How had he known? Who had told him that tensions were rising in Catolis when even Claudia had been saying there was none? What's been happening in the city that he had known and not them? And now a clinic's caught fire, and Claudia's messages are growing frantic, and even Ezran's messaging them now, borrowing Claudia's mirror to send them please to hurry back. They move as fast as they can, Callum on Vorobei bearing her jerkier movements in spite his lesser experience on a horse, Rayla on Kuritsa with her arms bracing her belly as she eases her into a hurried trot. They arrive in Catolis just before the beginning of Rayla's 21st week to find the tension is palpable the moment they cross under the gates of the city. The streets are quieter. The outer market is almost empty. There are guards stationed at the corners of buildings now, and Rayla feels the glares of the common folk on her the way she did when Ezran first invited her here as a guest 4 years ago. It feels as if everything they've worked for since the end of the war has vanished entirely, and she pulls Callum's cloak tighter, her arm coming to rest protectively over her belly beneath it. The remains of the clinic are blackened and still smoldering when they pass by it. It puts stiffness into Rayla's shoulders and a scowl on Callum's face, especially when they round the corner at the end of the street to find crowd gathered around a standoff between Rowena and an angry old woman. They shouldn't even be in this city, the woman snarls. How dare you defy me for an elf? You need to back off, mother, hisses Rowena, her hands curling into fists by her sides as Callum urges Vorobei forward and the crowd parts to let them through. Who I choose to be with isn't up to you. You insolent child. That's enough, snaps Callum, pulling the filly to a halt between them. He towers over the older woman, his eyes severe, his mouth set in a grim line. It's not up to you, he says coldly, and if you loved your daughter at all, you wouldn't be making a public spectacle of this. Why, your highness, stammers the woman. She shrinks as he glares at her, as Rayla pulls up behind them, shielding the couple from view of the crowd. I mean no disrespect to you, my prince, but disrespecting your daughter for her relationship is disrespectful to me considering my wife is an elf, the same as hers. Callum glares at her, and then at the crowd. This isn't a circus, he says, his tone harsh. Give them some privacy, for crying out loud. The crowd murmurs, but a couple of guards come riding around the corner, and they disperse, heading back to their homes and their businesses without argument. The old woman does the same, her eyes downcast, but she shoots a dirty look at Rayla when she thinks Callum's not looking. Rayla scowls back. Behind her, Callum mutters something to the guards, who nod and urge their horses back towards the castle, but Rowena and her partner on Kuritsa's other side catch her attention with simultaneous curtsies. "Your Highnesses," says Rowena, looking relieved. "You're back." Rayla grimaces at the title, and she shifts, climbing as carefully as she can off Kuritsa. The two women, girls, even, they can't be much older than 17, steady her, their hands on her elbows so she can support the bump on her way down. They'd always known Rowena was young, but her weariness as she stands protectively by her girlfriend makes her look even younger still. "What the heck happened?" Rayla asks them. "We thought the city got past this." The elf girl shuffles uneasily, but Rowena grips her hand and offers her an assuring nod. "It did," she mumbles. "Things were fine. There was tension, and there have always been humans who haven't quite adjusted but then the clinic burned down and now. This doesn't make any sense," grumbles Callum. "If things have been fine until now, what was Eldoris talking about then?" "We need to talk to Escoma," says Rayla, frowning. "I don't understand where all of this came from." "Neither do we, Your Highnesses," adds Rowena quietly. "Things were fine. And, oh." She curtsies again, looking apologetic. "Princess, the baby. I'd almost forgotten, I need to take a few more notes to make sure everything's okay, and..." "It's doing fine," Rowena says. Rayla. "Later. Things have been good, but we need to talk to Ezran first. I'll come and see you tomorrow at the Wishbone, all right?" "Of course, Princess." Rowena curtsies once more. "We'll let you be on your way." They turn, the elf girl opening the front door, eager to be out of the street, but Callum stops them. "Is this where you two live?" he asks. The elf girl hesitates. "Yes, Your Highness," she mutters awkwardly, unused to addressing anyone by such titles, Callum's rolling clumsily from her lips. He nods. "All right, stand back." They do, and Callum draws a rune into the air with both of his hands and mutters, "Premunio Maxima," into the shimmering character. The rune dissipates when he breathes into it, the air between him and the front door gleaming once, like glass, before the light disappears and he steps back. "So this doesn't happen again," he says firmly. "I'm not having any more bricks thrown through windows or fires while we're here." The girls sigh gratefully, their shoulders sagging. Rowena offers them both an appreciative smile and a quiet "thank you" before she curtsies a fourth time and ushers her girlfriend back inside. There's a pause. It's long and uneasy, and for the first time in years, Rayla feels a fear of humans growing in the pit of her stomach. She takes a shuddering breath, curling Kuritsa's reins around her hand to tug her off in the direction of the castle. "This is a mess," she grumbles. Callum snorts, falling into step on her left so that she's flanked protectively by them, him and Vorobei on her left, Kuritsa on her right. "Mess isn't the word I would use." Eleni meets them at the front gates. Rayla's grown so used to her outside of her armor that she almost doesn't recognize her, but she bows as they approach, relieved grimace flashing across her features. "Your Highnesses," she greets. "It's good to see you both. How are things coming along?" "Fine," says Rayla, frowning. "But that can wait until later." "What's happened? Is everyone okay?" "Things are tense," says Eleni. She beckons for them to follow, her shoulders visibly relaxing when the gates close behind them. There have been a couple of other bricks, some fighting in the streets, a lot of arguments between elves and humans, but nothing else as bad as the fire. No one else has been hurt, but the people are scared. Those opposed to the presence of elves here have never been so vocal, and it's worrying. His Majesty's done his best to address everyone's concerns, but nothing he proposes will satisfy them. There are a few people who won't settle for anything less than the complete removal of elves, but we all know King Ezran won't do that. We should never have left, mutters Callum. Eleni shakes her head at him. Something's riling them up, she says. Or someone. We've just had trouble finding the source. She leads them up through the castle, its familiar stone halls and narrow staircases, and to the chamber in the west tower that Ez sometimes uses as a classroom when he has the time to do a lesson with his tutors. Ezran's waiting for them there, along with Claudia, Soren, and Commander Gren and General Amaya. They look varying shades of relieved to see them, but Ezran greets them both with a tired smile and open arms. "I'm so glad you're back," he mumbles, hugging them each in turn. He hesitates at Rayla's belly, and, in spite of herself, Rayla lets out a chuckle and parts Callum's cloak to let him say hi to his impending niece or nephew. "Sorry to make you come rushing home," he says, his palms gentle against the bump. It's been a heck of a week." "So we've heard," says Callum. He frowns at them, Claudia, looking exhausted, Soren, leaning heavily on his cane, his Aunt Amaya with her jaw clenched, Gren looking more serious than they've ever seen him at her side. "What can we do?" "Right now," says Commander Gren as General Amaya signs her answer. "Not a lot. We're spread too thin. We don't have the manpower to monitor every street of the city and protect the castle and find the source of this hostility all at once. I sent word to Duran," says Ez. "Anya's happy to send some help, but she can't spare very many hands either, and it'll take some time before they get here." He heaves a sigh, removing his circlet to run his hands through his hair. "Gods, ruling is hard." "It was always going to be," says Callum grimly. "Do you at least know who did it?" "Set the fire, I mean." Soren clears his throat. "A couple of kids," he tells them, sounding tired. "They were being idiots. Said a lot of people were thinking it anyway, but didn't expect the situation to devolve into this. Pretty sure they threw that brick through the window of the Wishbone too. The problem is, now that they've done it, the crazy ones, the people who think Ez should kick all the other elves out. They're finding every excuse to start fights and arguments in the streets." They grimace at that. They'd seen it themselves, just now. "It's weird though," says Claudia, speaking up at last, her frown thoughtful. "Ez held court a little while ago to hear them out, but there's this subset of extremists that are all saying the exact same things, but it's not like they thought it out, I guess. Which is why we think someone's riling them up. Everything was too similar to be a coincidence, and it feels like someone's getting up in bar or something to talk nonsense at them and they're just soaking it up." Rayla raises an eyebrow at them. "What were their arguments, exactly?" Ez shrugs. "Dumb stuff. Elves are here to steal their businesses and buy their properties, except they are obviously not. A lot are here because it was closer than going all the way home, and then they stayed because they had kids or something. I asked them if it would be any different if we had immigrants from Delbar or Duran setting up businesses and buying properties, and apparently that's fine, but if it's elves, no, we can't have them." He makes a face, his tone tired and mocking. "They're mad over nothing. Competition is good for business, and if there were problems with elves and our economy, you'd think we might have noticed over the last 4 years. I'm telling you," says Soren. "You gotta make stronger decisions than this." "Right, because having people arrested for having an opinion totally doesn't make me a dictator. You can't not do something about it." "They have a right to free speech," Soren says, scowling at him. "Just because they're wrong, doesn't mean they have to go to jail. We've just gotta find whoever's encouraging all this and put a stop to it. Maybe then, things'll calm down." "I don't know that it'll be that easy," signs Aunt Amaya. "Ideas like these are hard to kill." "I know," grumbles Ez. He sighs, heavy and defeated, but he sets his jaw anyway, and nods at his makeshift personal counsel, determined to fix the problem. "One step at a time, okay. This is all we can do right now. X. They're back," the guard tells him. The tavern is loud again, but he pays them no mind. The news is more important. They were seen riding into the city this morning. "I know," says Balin, tapping his pile of maps with the bottom of his tankard. "They are spread out against the table in the corner booth of the tavern, and the blip that's been crossing them has come to a stop in a room in the north side of the castle." He snorts. "It's been almost too easy. It doesn't take much to manipulate the small minds of common folk. All it took from him was a whisper here, and an idea there, and the pressure within the city now has built up so much that he can reasonably expect all of this so-called progress to implode within a few days. The prince and his elf, too, are so obvious in their actions that it hasn't been difficult to predict what they'll do next. Of course they'd come back at the first sign of trouble. Of course they'd drop everything to come home and help, even if it means putting their whore of a princess in a city full of humans, tense and angry at elves. They're too good to abandon the city now. Well, says the guard impatiently, like Ezran's guards might burst into the tavern at any moment to arrest them both. Having them all together is dangerous. It won't be long before they pool their resources together to figure out what we've been doing. Can we move now, or what? Balin supposes it's true. Having them all together is dangerous, and for once, the guard's probably right. They need to act quickly now. There can be no mistakes. We can move, he says decisively, setting his tankard down to steeple his fingers under his chin. He smirks at the blip on his map. Let's get things underway. Notes. I had a day off, so here's an early update. Chapter 12. Summary. We did have our misgivings, he says, taking aim at her belly. Coming after a pregnant woman in the night is hardly sporting. This clears my conscience, just a little. Chapter text. 12. Everyone's on edge and it shows. They do their best to proceed as normal, to catch up, and to leave the thinking for the morning after they've all had a good night's sleep, but talk of the unrest in the city comes up anyway, and it's like their meeting was never adjourned, but they are still coming up with blanks. It's a complicated issue. Ez is right, they can't just allow the arrest of citizens for arguing in the streets, but tolerating intolerance isn't exactly a solution either. It won't go away if they don't do something about it, but until they find whoever's rallying anti-elf sentiments, there's nothing to do but wait and mediate problems where they can. They try to talk about other things when it feels like the conversation's been exhausted. Twice, Soren tries to make jokes about the situation, but they are in poor taste, and he's met with silence broken only by the crackling fire in the hearth. A little later in the afternoon, Claudia asks how things are going with the baby, and, later still, Ezran presses his hands to Rayla's belly, hoping to feel it kick. Rayla means to be patient with them, but it's hard. With the threat of civil war is hanging over their heads, one would think that there might be other things to talk about besides her pregnancy, and, frankly, she's sick of the attention. Surely they can hold their curiosity in for a day, but it's their way of distracting themselves, and she can't blame them for it. In the end, she lets them, her irritation dissipating when the baby moves under EZ's palms and he cracks a smile, a real smile, for the first time since they got in. Have you decided where you're going to have the baby? He asks her quietly, while Callum's talking to General Amaya and the afternoon wears on. Rayla shrugs. Here, I guess. I don't imagine we'll be going anywhere for a little while anyway, feel like we'll be needed here. Ez looks away a little guiltily at that. Thanks for coming back so quickly, he murmurs. It's nothing, Ez chuckles. Rayla. You're doing the best you can. Sometimes you just need the help anyway. I just wish things weren't so dumb. He sighs and runs a hand over his face, the bags under his eyes made even more conspicuous by the light of the dying fire. We got past this. There was this little while after you guys got engaged where everyone was genuinely happy with the way things were, elves in the city and all, and Catullus was this paragon of peace. I don't understand where all of that went. His face twists, frustrated and confused, and, for a moment, Rayla stares at him. You don't seriously think this is your fault, do you? Isn't it? Mumbles Ez. There's a sort of anguish on his face that makes Rayla's heart ache for him. He's 14. He's not even old enough to drink alcohol by the law of his own land, and he has to rule it. He shouldn't have to worry about this too. No, it's not, she says, almost offended he would even think that. Governing is hard, Ez, it always has been, and it always will be, and you're being unfair to yourself. He shakes his head at her. I'm the king, Rayla. It's my responsibility to look after these people, and they're at each other's throats because I invited other people into the city. I should have seen this coming. I should have done something about it earlier. You did. She gestures vaguely at herself, and at Callum, and at their mother's ring and the way it gleams on her finger. You said yourself that there was peace after we got engaged. That, to me, says that this worked, and that you know what you're doing, and that this isn't your fault. You're a good kid, Ez, and an even better king. We're going to fix this, I promise you that. That's a big promise, snorts Ez ruefully, but he offers her a grim smile anyway, his eyes softening at the swell of her belly. I'm really happy for you guys, he says after a moment. It just sucks that you can't have your baby in peace. All the more reason to fix it then, don't you think? Rayla grins at him despite herself, slumping in her chair a little and beckoning him forward with a finger. It's moving again, if you wanna have a chat to your future niece or nephew while it's awake. The change in EZ's demeanor is almost immediate, most of his anguish gone the instant he presses his palms against the bump. It sleeps, he asks curiously. Rayla lets out a laugh. Not really, there are times where it gets quiet, but it doesn't ever really stop moving. Sometimes it feels like it's trying to get comfortable. Other times, it feels like it's having a party. What's it feel like right now? Rayla pauses, repositioning his hands until he can feel the way it jerks a little beneath her skin. Like it's got the hiccups, she says, smiling fondly at the way his eyes go comically wide. He'd felt it before too, but she thinks he might be trying to imagine it this time. His grin is wide and unabashed as it twitches under his fingers, and she knows, already, that Ez will spoil this child rotten once it's born, and she doesn't even mind. He'll be as wonderful an uncle as Callum will be a father. She's glad to have them both. Do you guys have names? Just one so far, Rayla tells him mildly. Sorry, after your mother if it turns out to be a girl. EZ's eyes go wider still. Really, he breathes. Yeah. What do you think? Ez lets out a laugh, it's real, and happy, and excited, as it should be, devoid of all the stress and frustration that comes with ruling a kingdom. For the first time in a long time, he actually looks like the teenager that he is. Inwardly, Rayla calls it a job well done. It's perfect, he says at last. Don't you think so too, little moonbeam? The baby shifts like it agrees. X. Claudia and Soren go home after dusk. With all the tension in the city, they've been taking turns staying at the Wishbone when Eleni has to work the night shift at the castle. It's not like they can do much. Claudia's a mage who can't do magic without a primal stone, which she doesn't have, and Soren's a half-cripple who needs a cane to walk, but any extra eyes and ears are good eyes and ears as far as she's concerned, even with Callum's still active protective charms around the shop. They say goodbye to them within the castle gates, bid them to be safe, and to message when they get there, and to say hi to Aelus and Lesser and baby Turin from them. They are not elves, and there's no reason to believe anyone would try to stop them this late at night, but Callum and Rayla wait for them to disappear into the darkened city streets anyway, just in case. The evening air is cold tonight, the waning crescent moon dim as it hangs low in the sky. Maybe it's the presence of the extra guards on the streets, or maybe it's because things have changed so dramatically, or maybe it's their own paranoia getting the better of them, but the night is almost too still. It puts Rayla's teeth on edge and, out of instinct, her hands twitch towards her back for weapons that aren't there. Hey, says Callum, frowning. You okay? Rayla hesitates. The hairs on the back of her neck prickle, and something churns in her gut, like she knows there's something hiding in the shadows and her eyes just haven't caught up. She squints ahead of them, her hackles raised, frowns at the empty stone wall behind them, her nails digging into the flesh of her palms, her ears straining for sounds don't quite fit in. But there's nothing there. There's only silence, and darkness, and a familiar twisting in her gut that makes her wish she had her blades. Something doesn't feel right about this. She's not sure what, exactly. There's nothing amiss in this hall, or any of the others they've already crossed, but something feels off. Rayla. Callum's fingers touch her elbow and she almost jumps out of her skin. What is it? Rayla hesitates. Looks up and down the hall once more, but in the end, she shakes her head. It's nothing, she mutters at last. Everything's fine. She doesn't see the guards at the postern gates collapsing into armored heaps on the pavement, or the shadows darting across the far wall. It's almost too late when she does. I think I'm gonna stay up for a bit, she tells Callum when he climbs into bed. The churning in her stomach hasn't settled in the least, and the way the baby's moving, she might not get any sleep anyway. She rubs her belly absently, like somehow the action might soothe the child, which, in turn, might soothe her. It doesn't. If anything, it only makes her more apprehensive, and she paces across their bedroom, uneasy and uncomfortable, until Callum catches her hand and pulls her into bed. What's wrong? He asks seriously. Are you okay? Is the baby okay? Rayla hesitates. There's nothing there, she tells herself, because there isn't. She'd surreptitiously checked every corner and every shadow for herself on the way in. She's a trained assassin after all, and she's familiar enough with this castle that she knows all the best places to hide. If she can't see that something's there, it's probably not there to begin with, but the feeling gnaws at her still, settling stubbornly in her shoulders in a way that she can't shake off. "We're both fine," she says at last, gripping his hand for good measure. Something doesn't feel right." Callum frowns at her. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," she admits quietly. "It's hard to explain. With all that's going on. Maybe I'm just worried. Bub's a bit squirmy tonight as well. I'm just gonna stay up for a bit longer, I think." Callum stares at her, unconvinced. "I'll stay up with you, then." That makes her smile a little. "You don't have to do that." "Too late, my mind's made up." He offers her a grin, trying to look confident and dumb, but his eyes give him away. There's a sort of concern in them, one that trusts her instincts more than she trusts in them herself. He tries to be nonchalant about it, settles with his back against the headboard and puts his sketchbook in his lap, the way he used to all those years ago when they took in turns to keep watch. It's strangely soothing. Her stomach settles, her shoulders sag, and Rayla swings her feet into the bed, making herself comfortable under the covers next to him to watch him draw. It's an old ritual, one that dates back to the old days when they'd camped out in caves and clearings with ZYM. They'd been affectionate then, too, probably overly so, considering they'd only known each other a couple of months by the time they were comfortable enough to lean on each other like this, but the thought of it eases her mind. They must fall asleep at some point, because the next thing Rayla knows is that she jerks awake in the dark. The fire in their hearth has burnt itself out now, and Callum's head is heavy against her horns. His sketchbook is still in his lap, but his hand is limp on the page, pencil held loosely between his fingers on top of an unfinished sketch of her smiling down at her belly. Her lips quirk upwards at it, but the baby squirms in her womb, and she grimaces as she pries herself out of Callum's arms to use the bathroom. She's pretty used to moving around in the dark, but she lights the candle on the nightstand and takes it with her anyway. The night is dark and cold, the churning in her stomach still present, even now, and the light helps. The baby flutters the whole time. It's been more active at night, she's noticed, and she wonders if that's normal or if it might be a sign that it's taking after her and her connection to the moon. She chuckles fondly at it. She's on her way back to bed when she hears it, a soft clatter from down the hall. Rayla frowns. Her ears prick. Tension floods her body and her breath catches in her throat. She steps quietly across the room, her bare feet numb against the cold stone floor, picks the dagger off the nightstand, and presses her ear against the door. She hears nothing. Not a breath or a whisper, but she knows what she heard, and she unsheathes the dagger as she opens the door. There's no one. Not even the guards posted at the end of the hall. Her fingers curl tighter around the handle of the dagger, holding it at the ready across her chest as she ducks into the shadows and makes her way along the hallway. Still nothing. Then there's a creak. A window being opened from the opposite direction. The telltale creak of a bow being drawn. She spins, stepping lightly to the left to avoid the arrow that whizzes past her ear. The archer is human. His armor is light, made of leather instead of metal, his bow and his arrows smaller than usual. There's a dagger at his belt, and a pocket of throwing knives set into the leather strap across his chest. It's a familiar set of weapons, and she would know, because she's been trained in how to use all of them. They're assassin's weapons. "You're not supposed to be awake," the archer says, knocking another arrow. Rayla snorts at him, the dagger tight in her hands. "I imagine you're not supposed to be here, either, but here we are." He smirks, drawing his bow. "We did have our misgivings," he says, taking aim at her belly. "Coming after a pregnant woman in the night is hardly sporting. This clears my conscience, just a little." He lets it loose without further hesitation, and Rayla dodges out its path as she lunges towards him. He shoulders the bow as she comes, parries her blow with the dagger at his belt, his movements swift and practiced, even as she ducks under his arms and sweeps at his legs. He dodges back, using his momentum to flip out of her way, his hands flying to the set of throwing knives at his chest. He sets them at her, one after the other in such quick succession that Rayla barely has the time to scramble out of their way. She lifts the dagger, tosses it in her hand to better throw it, but his bow is drawn again, and the arrow that flies from it clips her sleeve and pins it to the wall behind her. Rayla hisses, letting the dagger drop and catching it with her other hand as he smirks cruelly and knocks another arrow. "I thought this would be a challenge, princess," he sneers. "I even brought reinforcements." "You'll need them," snaps Rayla. She tosses the dagger at him with her left hand, using the distraction to yank the arrow out of her sleeve and roll out of his way before he can let his another loose. His throwing knives are still in the walls, and she takes them while he tries to recover, but she's faster, knocks his bow out of his hands with one and gets him in the shoulder with another. He swears. Rayla takes the opportunity to charge forwards, dodging out of the way of his dagger to retrieve hers at his feet. She considers, for a moment,